getting started with Angular is really easy. It's as easy as sourcing a JavaScript library onto your page. So let's start with some simple HTML that I have here. This HTML has at the top a head tag. There's nothing in it so far. It's got a body tag with an input field cost that is going to hold a US currency cost, so like say $100. And then down below, we want it to format that US currency as $100.00 if the person puts in 100. So I'm going to go over here to Google hosted libraries. I've already opened this up and grab the Angular snippet. I need to add HTTP in here, bring it in. And the first thing I need to do is add ng app. And this tells Angular that there's an application here that it needs to handle. There's no arguments yet. We'll get to that later. And also I'm going to take out the min, because just in general, when you're working in development mode on Angular, you want to have the full error reporting, and that's not provided by the minified library. So good to go so far. The first thing we want to do is connect the input to a model element in the system. So we're going to call that model element cost. Now we're going to go down here into the template and format cost. Or in this case, really just copy cost into the template. Refresh the browser. Type in 100, yep, and you get now the two-way data binding already. Cool, so dynamic behavior without actually writing any JavaScript code so far at all, really. Actually, it's hidden. This is JavaScript code, but we'll get there. Next thing to do is we want to format this. So let's format this as currency. Refresh the browser, and yep, now we're using Angular's built-in currency formatting mechanism to format that number, 100, as currency, in this case, 1000.00, even with a comma. Really nice. Okay. So I wanted to contrast and compare these two systems. I want to contrast and compare Angular versus jQuery, because jQuery is something that all of us are pretty familiar with. So let's see how this might be done in jQuery. So first off, let's go over to the jQuery page. I've called this index_JQ. It's over here in Sublime. So first off, we've gone and brought in the jQuery API. Fantastic. Now, one thing we need to do is put an ID on here because we need to access the element. Call it cost. Now we need a place to put it. So we're going to turn this into a span. So that's our formatted cost. Now we need to write our jQuery. All right, that's looking pretty good, but I'm pretty sure I didn't get all the edge cases and do all the error handling. I'm pretty sure I didn't, actually. And we can kind of contrast and compare the two here. First, there's an awful lot of JavaScript going on here, and it's just to reformat something into some American money, right? It's the inner text of a span tag. It's going and doing a lot of math. It's just a lot of work and a lot of granularity of effort. Plus, it's not internationalizable, right? So if the locale is something different than the US, it's not going to go and change the currency formatting depending on that either. So with jQuery, you're really down in the weeds and the minutia of building out your app. And that's not really where you want to be when you're thinking about building larger applications. And let's face it, any application you're going to write is going to be bigger than this one. So let's have a look back at the Angular version, see that we're dealing with a model. It's a simple model for sure. But as an author, you don't have to worry about watching the model change or updating the UI. That just happens for you while you worry about the problem domain of your customer. So even in this small example, it's clear that Angular enables you to concentrate on your problem domain and not on the small details of the client-side implementation. And really, we've only just begun. As you'll see with the addition of controllers, directives, and other powerful Angular features, you'll be able to make astoundingly complex and feature-rich client-side applications without pulling your hair out, dealing with all the minutia. We've taken a simple web page and ended up with a rudimentary Angular application. Now you'll be able to do this for yourself. Next, we're going to dive into controllers and then more deeply into some of the more powerful Angular directives. Let's start up where we left off with the Angular example from before, but get rid of the Google-hosted libraries, the jQuery stuff, and that. We're not going to be using any of that anymore. So we have a text control that displays and formats a value. But what if we want to start with the initial value for that control? There are a few ways to do it with Angular, but really what we want to do is create a controller. A controller is like a manager, choreographing all of the action between all of the controls and displays on the page. If you're familiar with the model view controller pattern, the template, which we've been working with so far, is called the view. And the controller is both the controller and the model. It both contains the data and manages events from the view that change that model. To create a controller, we start by simply defining it with the code in the head tag. This function defines an Angular controller called costControl. It takes one parameter, and that parameter is the scope. The scope is where you define all of the data as well as any event handlers and any custom functions. Now let's use this controller by adding the ngController directive to the body tag that contains the UI. So now we've connected the cost controller to the body tag. Let's refresh and see if there's any difference. There isn't because we haven't yet defined what the initial value of the cost variable is. Let's do that. Cool. So now let's experiment a little bit. First, let's factor this into a div. And let's copy and paste that a couple of times. So now we have 3 different instances of this. Let's give it a try and see if we make a change. Interesting. So notice what happens when I change one, the other doesn't change. And that's because the scopes are isolated between the two. The controllers are the same code, the logic is the same, but the data is not shared. This is really important to understand as you think about how to construct your controllers and where you need to locate data and decide whether it's going to be global or local to that particular controller. Okay, so let's delete the duplicate template code and add some functionality to the original. So here we're defining a tax, and at this point the tax is 15%, which is pretty stiff, and we want to display it. Let's do that. Currently it's at 150.02. What happens when I change this? So the cost changes, and that's cool, but the tax doesn't. And that's because Angular isn't doing any magic for you. It's setting the tax to whatever the scope cost was at that time that it was defined. In order to watch the changes to cost, we need to actually call the scope watch function. Scope watch takes 3 parameters, but the first 2 are really the most important. The first is the expression to watch, and the second is the function to call when that expression has changed. So in this case, the expression is cost, and the function is the code that's going to calculate the new tax. So let's see if this is going to work. And indeed it does. Cool. Now it's important to note that we don't need to first set the tax value, right? The reason being because cost actually does change. It changes from undefined to 1000.1. So that scope watch function is actually invoked by Angular right away when the page loads. Another interesting thing about watch is that the function takes 2 parameters, new value and old value. So you could put in here if you wanted to only calculate the tax when the new value is different from the old value. It's overkill in this case, but you can imagine where such a test might be important if the corresponding activity is network or CPU intensive. So let's say we want to create a grand total, which is the cost plus the tax. We can create a new watch method that watches when the tax changes, and then builds the total. And now we want to show it. This works because changing the cost first fires the cost change callback. That callback in turn sets the tax value, which in turn calls the tax change callback. But since nothing watches the total except for the template is updated and we're done. Angular does all of that dependency tracking for you. Now you can also do this, since you can watch any expression that you want. You can also create a new function in the scope and pass that function to the $watch methods. In this case, I'm calling the update and it sets both the tax and the total. But really that second call to watch is really just redundant because it's already being set. So we learned a lot about controllers here. We've learned about how to define them. We've learned about how their scopes are isolated. We've learned about the $watch method and adding custom functions to the scope. And we've learned about the role of controllers in the overall architecture of AngularJS. The next step is to learn about managing the interaction with different types of inputs like buttons, combos, and so on. Picking up where we left off in the last section, we have a simple calculator that takes a price and formats it and shows a tax and a total. So let's add some checkboxes that gives the user some options. The Add Tax button allows the user to say whether they want to have us add the tax, and the Show Total button allows the user to decide whether they want to see the total or not. Not the best UX design ever, but that's not really the point. The point is to see how we reference a variety of different input mechanisms. So let's refresh the page. And we note that all of the checkboxes are off by default. Let's turn on Add Tax by default. Refresh the page, and yep, that's on. That's really nice, actually. That just setting a value to true and bang, it's on. Really nice. But of course that doesn't do anything, so let's change that. Here I'm using the question mark or ternary operator to say that if the tax is on, then the tax value is the cost times 15%, and if it's false, then it's just 0. You could spell it out with an if and an else conditional, but I think the equation's so simple that it's just cleaner this way. And we can refresh the page, and we'll see change the tax. But it's still not changing. So let's add a change handler. And refresh the page. Cool. Now that works very well. Now we could also do this instead and use the expression of the cost plus the tax boolean, but what does that really mean? To find out, we can add this expression to the template and then refresh the browser. Notice how the Add Tax checkbox being on adds 1 to the value. If it's false, then 0 is added. That's because of how JavaScript handles adding a boolean to a number. If it were me, I'd probably just go with 2 watch methods because it's cleaner about my intention and it would probably be easier to maintain. Regardless, let's get that out of there. Now, there was another checkbox about totaling the bill. Let's add some template code. The ng-show directive here shows or hides the tag and its contents, depending on the state of the boolean. So if we refresh the page, we can see that by clicking on the checkbox that either shows or hides the total area. But in all honesty, while that works, you're not learning a lot, so let's implement that ourselves so that we can learn a little bit more about the Angular templates. Let's start in the controller. And here we're setting a new scope variable called bill_display to either block or none, depending on the state of the flag. And we can go back to the template. And set the style to that value. This is basically what ng-show is doing for you. So let's try that out. And here we're setting a new scope variable called bill_display to either block or none, depending on the state of the flag. So let's go back to the template. And set the display style to that value. So this is basically doing what ng-show does for you. Let's go over to the page, show and hide the total, and that works. Excellent. Okay, let's add a button to see how that works. So in this case, what I want to do is keep a running tally of the purchases. So this add button will add the current value to a running total that we'll call the final bill. So let's go back up to the controller. Now this is a click handler. The add function in the scope is called by the button whenever it's clicked because of the ng click directive. To display the final bill, we'll need just a little bit more template code. And we can refresh the browser and have I'll look at all this in action, show the total, and now we'll add it, add a new value, and we'll add that, and we get a high running total and so on, and that's really cool. Okay, so there are two things I want to show, select boxes and radio buttons. So let's add some shipping options to the controller. And as you can see, this is an array of shipping options along with their cost. And the currently selected shipping option, which is called shipping, is set to the first value in the shipping options. So the next thing we need to do is add a select box to the template to show the current shipping option and allow the user to select a new one. And what you see here is the familiar ng model to connect it to a scope variable, in this case shipping, and a new directive called ng options that tells Angular how to set up the options in the select. In this case, we're saying that we want to take the name for every item in shipping options. Now, if we go over to the browser and refresh, we should see the select, and it's got all the shipping options. Very cool. But it doesn't do anything yet, so let's add a small change. So this just adds the shipping amount to the total. Let's go over to the page now and see this work. Refresh and show the total. Express. Okay. Nothing's happening. I think I see what's happening. So we still have to do a watch because that value is changing, but we're not refreshing the update yet. So let's go do that. And we'll refresh the page, show the total, and yep, awesome. We're adding the shipping value to the total value. Excellent. So what if we want to do this with radio buttons? How would we change around the UI? Okay, so I've taken out the select, and now I want to go and make a change to the controller. So in this case, it's just going to be a simple value for the total cost because it's going to get the amount from the radio button itself and then just apply that. And it's going to start off at 10. So let's refresh the page and see if this works. Cool, yes. We have a flat rate, express, super express. Let's see that they're added to the total. They are, but they're done in the wrong way. So we need to do the parse float thing that we did before. And let's refresh the page and show the total. That looks right. But I'm not a fan. I really like the select and I like the objects. It was just right. So let's see if we can get there. Let's undo a couple of our changes. So first we're now going to wrap the input in a label. So we wrapped the input in a label, we got rid of two other labels, and we turned the label into its own template and put it in an ng repeat system. So as Angular goes through the shipping options, it's going to set each one to the value of s because of the ng repeat. So s in shipping options is going to iterate through shipping options and set s to each one as it goes through, and then create an input for each type. So let's go over to this, put the BR inside. Now let's have a look. So we've created a value for each one to the total, and it changed properly. Sweet. So in this new version of the code, shipping options is an array that's going to drive the creation of each of the inputs, and I think that's a little bit more elegant than having the individual hard-coded elements and with the values. So we're still using options as an object, but we're getting the most out of it. Now, it's a little advanced based on where we are so far. In the next couple of sections, we'll go through this ng-repeat and show how that can be used more broadly. So in this segment, we looked at, let's see, 4 different new types of controls: checkboxes, buttons, select boxes, and radio buttons. And we've seen how to integrate all those together within an Angular application through the use of the controller. So at this point, you should be pretty excited about just how easy it is to make a reasonably complex application in dynamic HTML using Angular, and to make one that's maintainable and easy to understand for both you and the other members of your team. In the last segment, we had single values for the various scope variables: cost, tags, and totals. And these are just single atomic values, but rarely in the real world do we deal with that type of data. Normally, we're dealing with objects and arrays. So let's start off with a simple page, add a controller that has some arrays and objects, and show how to display and use them throughout this video. Here we have a simple contacts control. It's got a list of people, our contacts. Let's go and add that to the body. And then display it. And in this case, you get what you think you would, which is a JavaScript dump of the object, which is not quite a particularly good UI. So let's go and build a bunch of divs around that. Better. So in this case, we have one div per person, and the way that we do that is by using the ng-repeat directive, which is basically the for loop of the Angular templating system. In this case, we're saying iterate through the array people one at a time and set the value of the variable name person to each person in the people array as it iterates through that loop. And then within that, we're just putting the string for that person's name into the body of the div. One person per line, basically. But even that is a little simplistic. What if your contact list is far more likely an array of objects, which is like something you'd see from the JSON-based REST service, so something like this. Let's simply refresh the browser and see what happens. And again, we get our JavaScript dump of the variable. So how do we go and get back to what we had before? Better. Now, let's make this a little more clear. Let's add some more detail to this in case let's just do some phone numbers. No difference as we refresh the browser, so let's go and add that in. That's okay, but nobody has just one phone in today's world. Let's go and make that an array. And we get nothing because we changed the field name, so let's change that. And again, we get the JavaScript dump because it's an array. So one way we could do this is just to use a JavaScript join. Great, but not awesome. Let's break that out into a set of spans. That's cute, but what happens if I want to bring that comma back? You can do something like that, which basically says if $index, which is the current index, is greater than 0, which means that it's the second, third, fourth, fifth, so on item, then show a comma. You could always use ngIf if you want. Same thing. Although in the case of ngIf, it just includes it or excludes it out of the DOM. It's physically not in the DOM if it's not there. So the final thing I want to do in this video is show a little bit of interactivity, and we want to go and build out a detail view that you can show and hide. So let's change over to that. We'll start by changing that to a div, and then we'll inset that div. That's pretty. So now let's only show that if it's hidden or shown on a Boolean. And because that starts off as undefined, which is basically the equivalent of false, it doesn't get shown. So now we have to create a way to show it. Very cool, but what if we also want a way to hide it now that it's actually shown? That's okay, but really you should only show it if you need to be able to show it, and hide if you need to be able to hide it. Very cool. We've learned a lot about how to deal with arrays and objects in Angular, as well as how to display them using various methods, particularly ngRepeat, and how to deal with very common problems of list and detail areas. The next place to go from here is to look at nested controllers and how those can help you build a more organized and maintainable application. Starting with the previous segment, we have a contacts list that has some expandable and collapsible phone numbers detail sections. But that last part where the phone numbers are hidden or shown by some code right in the ng-click handler, that troubles me. I don't like logic in the template. I want the template just to define how things are displayed. So let's clean that up, first by adding some controllers that'll factor that out better and add some interactivity. And then, as a fun bonus, we'll go and add some cool CSS3 transitions that'll make this really neat. Let's start by adding a thing called person controller. And add into it some methods for showing and hiding the number area. And let's add the controller to the div. No change yet, but what we need to do is change the ng-click handler. Nice. So now this is well factored, I think, between what's going to go on in the controller, which is the logic, and what's going to go on the template, which is the view logic. All right, now let's have some real fun and make this thing a little bit more dynamic by adding a way to add a person to the contact list. Let's start by adding a button. And then let's add it to the scope. Let's have a look at that. Very cool. Now this is cool and all, but today's users want a really nice, smooth transition look to things. And Angular provides a way for me to do that through CSS and the Angular animation stuff. So we have to start out by adding a little bit of CSS. Here is a gray class, and we can try it out by using something like ng class odd, which sets every odd element in a repeat to whatever class you want. There's also an ng class even if you want. It's a nice thing to do if you have tables, just to show a little bit more about how you can do styling in CSS with ng repeats. I'll do this. This just bolds anything after the first element. It's just a way to show you that you can use templating logic inside of attributes, in this case, the style attribute. So let's get on to that fun animation stuff that I was talking about. And the first thing to do is actually bring in the Angular Animate library. That's as easy as just bringing in Angular Animate. No change to the pages yet, but one thing that we need to do is create an app. We need to create an app because we need to have something to hang ng-animate on. ng-animate is brought in by the Angular animate script tag that we just put in, and it's what gives us our animations. We also need to invoke this by saying ng-app equals. Now the next thing that we need to do is bring in a whole bunch of CSS that's specific to the ng-animation stuff. I just got this from the Angular Animate basic documentation, but you can find there's a lot of sources out there for it. And change the class name to person. Now we need to go and say that that is a person, so we'll add on class person. Refresh over here. And now when we add, Mary fades in as she enters. That's really cool, right? Smoothly appears. Very nice, very modern. So in this section, we've learned about nested controllers, then we've learned some more about CSS and classing and styling, and finally about animations. Our final section on controllers will cover sharing data between controllers. In our final segment on controllers, I want to dig into nested controllers a little more so that you get a solid sense of where you should put data in your application. In particular, with big applications, you're probably going to want to have a hierarchy of controllers, and figuring out where data should go in that hierarchy is really important. So let's start out fresh and think about how a login system might look like. Okay, so a system that maintains a user session will have some type of main controller right at the top level that has the currently logged in user as part of its state, as part of its scope. So let's make that. So this is a simple controller called main controller that has one variable called user, and that variable either has the user name if the user is logged in, or it's null in this case if the user isn't logged in. So let's attach that to the body. And then we need to display that somewhere just to let both us and the user know if they're logged in. So let's add that to the template. And let's refresh the page. All right, looks like I forgot to make it an ng application there. No problem. Easily fixed. So we have two divs and two nested divs that are either hidden or shown based on the user, using the ng show and ng hide directives that we've seen before in order to do that. And if the user is logged in, then we put the name in there. In this case, it's just telling us that we're logged out, which is right. So now we want to create a login form. and I want to create a controller for that form. In fact, whenever you think of a form or a dialog, you should probably think controller. This time I'm going to start with a template since I'm already there. So this is going to be a floating element off to the right side with a little styling on it to make it look nice and all. And now we need to reference that in the controller. So let's make that. And we know we're going to need an input field so that the user can put in their login name. So let's add that as well. And now I want to go back to the template and add that input field. So this is where it's starting to get interesting. The name is pretty clear, right? We're in the login controller. The login controller has a name variable. But how does it get access to user? It gets access to user because the login control is nested inside of the main controller. And nested controllers share the variables of the parent controller. So let's refresh the page and see the control. And yes, it's there. So let's add some buttons. And these buttons either show or hide depending on the state. So let's refresh and see that login button there as it should be in the logged out state. Now we need to handle those buttons, which means we need to have some way to set the user variable. Let's in turn add that to the main controller. And then let's add the code for the login and logout buttons. So let's try logging in. And let's try logging out. So pretty cool how the whole state of the display changes. But let's just step back for a second and take a look at the data isolation here. User is effectively a global variable because it's at the main controller level. And that makes a certain amount of sense because there are lots of areas of the app that will need to know that the user is logged in. But the user name variable, which is really just required by the form, is isolated just the login controller. So since the main controller doesn't need to know about that variable, the name until the login is successful. If we had a password field, the same thing would apply. It would just be in the login controller. Scope variables should be held as closely as possible to where they need to be used and not be visible anywhere else. Another way to isolate stuff is to use Angular's built-in eventing model. So let's rewrite to use that. First, let's get those buttons to emit events instead of directly calling the setUser method. The $emit function takes two parameters. The first is the event name, and you have total control over that. So I just picked login and logout. These should really be event style names, though. The second parameter is any additional data you want to send. It can be anything you want. It can be a simple value like this, like scope username, or it can be an array or an object, whatever is appropriate to the event. And then on the receiving side, we need to add event listeners to the main controller. Let's give that a try in the browser. And it works just like it did before. The $on function also takes two parameters. The first is the event name, so in this case, login or logout. And the second is the function that will get called when that event is thrown. That handler takes two arguments. The first is the event object, and the second are any of the parameters that you send along with the event. So it's just my humble opinion, but in this case, I think the event model is clearer than the direct method call, and it's a good separation of concerns. And it's clear that the main controller is expecting certain events. It's not clear to me that when a controller defines methods, that they will be accessed from any other controllers. In fact, I would find that sort of thing surprising, since I feel like a local button handler is just kind of really a private method that needs to be shared between the template and the controller, but other controllers really don't need to be able to call those. Not that JavaScript supports anything much in terms of public and private methods. So I hope this example has made a relationship between controllers and nested controllers a little bit more clear. We certainly see that methods and variables are shared between a parent controller and all of its nested controllers, and that nested controllers can use the method of the parent or send events to the parent to update its state. So now that you understand how data sharing works, you should be able to build out complex applications with a bunch of controllers and not go crazy with the data and the methods being spread out all over the place. So far in this course, we've just been including Angular on the page using a script tag. But when you really want to get into things like REST development and stuff like that, you need a server to work with. So from here on out, we're going to be using Yeoman to help us set up an Angular application stack, which includes a server. Yeoman is an application builder. You tell it what application template you want to use. In our case, we'll be using the Angular template. And from there, you'll be asked a few questions about how you want it configured. It'll build out all the starter files for your application. With Yeoman, you'll be able to create complex applications that are served out of a built-in node server. The advantage of doing this is as you get into things like Ajax or routing or testing, it's a lot easier to do this if you have a server and if you have all the stuff that Yeoman sets up for you already. So let's start by installing Yeoman, and that begins by installing Node.js, since Node.js is required to run Yeoman. Now, a quick word about Windows in particular. This walkthrough of setting up Yeoman presented here is for Mac OS X, and pretty much for Linux as well. There's a good walkthrough on how to install Yeoman on Windows using one of several different techniques on the Decodize website that we've attached as part of the text content portion of this presentation. So now with that digression over, let's talk a little bit about Node. If you're not familiar with Node, it's a JavaScript interpreter that runs on the server. And it's being used now to build web servers, to automate build tasks, to build tests for web applications, all kinds of things. Knowing Node is going to give you a great advantage in the workplace. The easiest way to install Node is to use the Node Version Manager, or NVM for short. That starts by doing a search for it on Google, which takes you here to the GitHub Creation NVM page. Here you can see how to install it. I'm not going to do that, but I am going to use it on the command line here to install version 0.10 of Node. At the time of this writing, Node version 0.10 was the most recent stable release. Node does the versioning system where the odd releases are the development releases. So 0.11 is the current development branch with all the unstable new features. Once those become stabilized, they'll become 0.12 and development will restart on the 0.13 branch. If you're looking for Windows stuff, you can look at the nodejs.org download site, and that tells you how to install Node for Windows. The next thing to do is install Yeoman using npm. npm is the Node Package Manager, npm, not to be confused with NVM, which is the Node Version Manager. Go figure. Let's have a look at the Yeoman page. Here, this is the homepage for Yeoman. It shows us how to install Yeoman by using npm-install-g yo. Let's do that. The -g tells npm that we want to install it globally. Takes a little while, not too long, depending on your web connection. So now that we've installed that, let's just look at yo. It's installed. I'm going to Control-C out of that. Now I'm going to make a to-do directory to hold my app. CD in there. The next thing we need to do is install the generator for Angular. Yeoman doesn't come with it automatically, so we're just going to do npm install-g the generator for Angular. Cool. Looks like we're pretty much close to home. Let's hit yo Angular. Okay, that looks good. The next thing to do is to check if it runs using grunt serve. This does something really cool in that it not only starts a web server, but also a live reloaded view of the home page in your browser. With this live reload system, your changes will appear as soon as you hit save on the page. So let's look at some of the files and how they're structured and then show you how pages automatically update. I'm going to stop the server and start Sublime in this directory. And then restart the server. From what you can see in Sublime here, there are 3 areas where you'll be spending your time. The first is in the app directory. This has all of the application JavaScript code, the CSS, the images, the HTML, all of it. The second important part is the bower.json file. This lists any JavaScript dependencies. As you can see here, we have a dependency on Angular, JSON 3, ES5 shim, so on and so forth. That's all brought in by Yeoman on its own. And over time, we'll add some more. And finally, there's gruntfile.js. This file defines all the tasks like serve that were just used to start the server, or the build task that takes all your application, minifies all the CSS and JavaScript, and creates a dist directory that has all the compiled files. Now to see the live reload functionality in action, let's go to the app directory, then into the views folder and change the main HTML file to say hello world. Now I'm going to hit save and notice, boom, the browser changes right away without me hitting refresh. Save. Boom. Same thing for CSS, JavaScript, whatever. So no more refresh from you from here on out. Okay, we've come a long way in a short time to get Node and Yeoman all set up, and you'll find that Yeoman is an invaluable tool for helping you build out your web application. From here on out, we need to tweak the server code a little bit to get some server-side code running. Then we'll show you how to use Angular to access your new server code. Over the next couple of segments, we're going to be building up a to-do list application. I know you've seen those a bunch of times before. It's because they do a pretty good job demonstrating the basics. And as a teacher, I don't need to go into all the details about how to-do lists work. Or at least I hope I don't have to. If you're actually interested in that sort of thing, I recommend a book entitled Getting Things Done. It's an excellent book about organizing your life and reducing stress. But anyway, back to the course. At this point, we need to build out a web service that will drive our application. And that starts actually within the gruntfile.js of the application that we just created. At the top of the file, just under the use strict, we're going to import a middleware.js file that we're going to create. So our middleware is going to take 2 options. The first is connect, and the second is the existing array of middleware provided by Live Reload. And we're going to augment the Live Reload stuff with our own. So let's now go make that middleware.js file. So now all we're doing here is just returning the array of items as JSON. So let's have a look and see if this actually works. It does. Awesome. That is great. Good news. Okay, pretty much the hard part is behind us. We just have to go and add in some more middleware as we go. Our REST API is going to have 4 things. It's going to have the ability to get the list of to-do items. It's going to have an ability to add a new to-do item, to replace a to-do item or edit it, and then the ability to remove a to-do item. And we're going to differentiate those 4 different activities based on the request types. So in this case, I'm going to go and build out get and post. Now, get is just going to return the existing list of items just like it does today. And post is going to create a new item. So the first thing we need to do here is get the body of the post. This is going to add on to the body when the server is giving us new data. And then when it's done, it's going to call end. At which point we can parse the data and add it to the to-do items. One thing that we're going to need is a unique auto-incrementing ID to ID each to-do item as added to the list. So let's create that. And then because we're creating a new one, let's increment it. Now let's go and parse the data into an object. Let's go and add an ID onto that object. Let's add the object to the list. And finally, let's stringify the response and return the entire list of items. Now let's go back to the terminal, reboot the server. And once that's ready, we'll use curl to go and access the API via the command line. So this is returning to us just the empty array. Let's go and do a post. Now that's returning to us the entire array of to-do items. And yes, that's been saved in memory, which is great. Okay, what's next? The next thing to do is implement update. So now we have a list of items and we have the ability to add new items. We have to have the ability to update an item in place. So the first thing we need to do is have two accessors that will go and, given an item ID, give us back the object. So this function is going to return the index of a given ID into the item list, or return -1 if that ID is undefined. And this one is going to actually return us the individual object for a given ID. The next thing to do is to go and add in some code that will go and parse the ID out of the URL. So in the case of ID1, the URL is going to be like API v1 to do /1. And we want to get the /1 off the end and use that as the ID. The next thing to do is to look at the ID that we're getting back. And if in the case of a get, if we have an ID, then we want to return that specific item. Otherwise, we just return the entire list of items. We want to do something similar on post and update just the item if an item ID is specified. Now there's a lot of error checking and things like that I could put in here, but I'm not going to do that just for the case of brevity. All right, so asking for 1 got us back nothing. Asking for everything got just an empty array. Let's go and add a new item. Then let's go and get that item. Very cool. And we can even update that item. Fantastic. I know this has been a really long lecture so far. All I have is one last thing to do, and that's implement the delete function. Let's look for the delete verb. So in this case, we're just going to find the index element, and once we've got it, slice it off. Let's just run this one last time. Get the list, add a new item to the list, add a new item to the list, update it, get the list again, and finally delete an item. And we can see that nothing's there. Very, 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 very cool. So I know there was no Angular in this segment, but this was all really just prep work that was necessary to give us a REST service that our Angular application could talk to. That being said, what you've learned here might help you in building your own applications in the future. I know I've run into situations where the backend code wasn't quite ready and I just needed something to connect to so that I could write some code around the specification. Now, there is a mock system in Angular that can help you do this sort of mocking work, but sometimes you really want to connect to a server to see it work. And that's when a system like this, simple middleware stuff, can really help and come in handy. The next step is to dig in with Angular and really start using this REST API that we built here. So now that we have our REST-based to-do list service all ready to go, I think it's time to start working on the UI and back into Angular. And that means getting the list of to-dos and displaying them on the main page. So let's get rid of Hello World and actually put something on there that makes some sense. So what I'm setting up here is that we're going to have a list of to-dos in the to-dos array, and then it's going to have the text items as we had before. And these are each going to go into a Bootstrap row inside of a Bootstrap call MD12. Now, I actually haven't mentioned yet that we're using Twitter Bootstrap, so let me talk a little bit about that. We're using Twitter Bootstrap version 3, and if you're not familiar with Twitter Bootstrap, it's a responsive UI framework that was originally written by the engineers at Twitter. The great value of Bootstrap is that it's responsive, which means that if you follow the CSS gridding guidelines, it will look good on a smartphone, a tablet, or a desktop without you having to do much custom work at all, or maybe none. In fact, the little app that in our little app, we're just going to use CSS Bootstrap classes, as is. So back to Angular, I'm just going to use the repeat directive and go over each of the to-dos and put out the to-do list item text for each one. So let's now go and actually make the call and go and get our to-dos. So I start off here by creating an empty array of to-dos, and then we make the get call to our API v1 to-do. And when that returns successful with the data, we then set the scope to-dos to that data. Nothing in there at the moment. Let's go and add something. Excellent. Now we actually have the AngularJS UI talking to our API in the back end. Let's try one more time just because this is really exciting. I got too excited for my own good there. So the next thing to do is create a text field where we can go and enter a new to-do item and then have it posted to the server. So one thing I really want to do here is create a new controller to wrap all of this. So let's go and do that. We're going to call that the to-do controller. Let's also set the new to-do. Make sure that works. It does. Keep it empty for the moment. And what we want to do is use the ng key up attribute to say whenever the keyboard lifts up, so we've got a new keystroke, we're going to want to go and inspect that keystroke. And we're going to want to look to see if somebody's hit return. So what they can do is just type in their to-do item and hit return, and it'll automatically get sent to us. So let's go and add that functionality. And what we're looking for is the key code. That's going to tell us which key was hit. In this case, we're going to want to look for key code 13, which is enter or return. And from there, we're going to want to go and post, because we're going to go and create a new to-do item for the given to-do text. So instead of get, we're going to want to do post. And post takes a block of data. So in this case, text, the new to-do. Awesome. And we remember that we get back from post the new list of updated to-dos. Bingo. You type in some text, you return, and it adds a new item. What would be even better is if it got rid of the existing item. Let's just copy that in there. And notice that every time I'm hitting refresh or save, it's still getting the data from the server because that's all kept in memory. So let's add another. And it's automatically getting rid of the existing to-do. This is really looking nice. This is actually pretty sweet so far. So what I'm going to do is end it here. We're going to go and in the next segment talk about how to do posting and deleting and updating. But at this point, you should have a pretty good idea of how to make some basic requests to the server using the $HTTP functionality. In particular, the most fundamental two types of requests, the GET request and the POST request. Next, we're going to add up the delete and update functionality of the application, as well as use some animation functionality in Angular to give it a really nice polished feel. Now that we can list to-dos and add new ones, it's time to allow the user the ability to delete to-dos. So let's start over by adding a done button to each template. Before we do that, let's have a look over here at the JS hint output, and that's telling us that there were some issues in our code. So let's have a look at those. First off, the new to-do is not in camel case, so let's fix that, as well as in the template. Plus there's this equals instead, or double equals instead of triple equals. Let's fix that. I agree with that. And then finally, it's telling us that the $scope is not used, so let's get rid of that. Make sure everything's still running. Great. Perfect. All right. Now we want to go and add a done button in front of each one of these. And this will allow the user to say that they're done with these tasks, and it'll send off a delete message to the server using the delete method on HTTP. Now, one thing we need to do is get the new updated list once it's been deleted. So let's go and change this around a little bit to say, make that a generic function and just call it. And call it here. So let's try that out. Perfect. Great. Now we can go and delete ones. That's really cool. But let's have a look at this just to show some of the power of Angular here. So first off, what's happening? We're getting in this to-do ID, and that's automatically mapping to the to-do in the ng repeat, which is a pretty strong and cool design. If you can think back to jQuery, you'd have to do something like this. Data ID equals some, number in there, and then automatically get the ID out of the attribute and map it and all that sort of stuff. Angular is doing all that for you for free, and it's doing it for you really easily. So there's a huge benefit here in terms of simplicity to using Angular instead of the jQuery equivalent. Let's drill down into that a little further, but first off, I see a JS print. Okay, we're not using data. That's true, so let's get rid of that. Always good to keep an eye on JS hint and see if you're creating any problems as you're running along. Let's change this to an input text so that we can now show how to update. Inputs as opposed to just text. And let's add on that ng key up so when we key up, we can save. So again, we're going to be looking for the key code equal to 13. Then we're going to add on the ID of the to-do, as well as use the new to-do text, which is going to be maintained by Angular. We're not going to worry about the data coming back. We're not going to worry about the changing of the to-do to empty, which we don't need, but we are going to update, which we could just do by doing that. And we'll do the same over here. Try again, hit return, hit refresh. Awesome. So that's saving and deleting. Perfect. Great. So the last thing I wanted to do was have some fun with this. Bring back in the animation stuff that we played around with early on in the course and show how that works in this scenario and show a little caveat that comes in with animation using ng-repeat and especially from data coming back from the server. So I want to go over here to my other pane and then do Bower install Angular Animate with save, and that's going to use Bower to bring in the Angular Animate module. A little bit of choices to make there, no big deal. Over here, make sure everything's still working. Excellent. Now we need to say that we're going to use ng-animate in here. And we need to go get that CSS again. And I'm going to put it into here. This time, instead of a person, it is a task. So I'm going to add on class task to here. Save that. And now I'm noticing that they're all fading in when the page comes up. That's really cool. Well, that's interesting. And that's the gotcha that comes with using ng-repeat with data coming back from the server. So here, let me explain this a little bit. What's happening is that behind the scenes, ng-repeat is doing a little magic with your arrays. It's actually adding on some IDs so that it knows when you're adding or changing elements by tracking internally using its own ID. But what comes back from the server doesn't have that Angular augmented ID on it. So you need to hint to Angular that this is the same array and these are the same elements. So what you need to do is put on track by and then an ID, and we're going to use todo.id, which is being auto-generated by the server. So let's fix that. Go over here, and I'll say another new one, and only that one will be added to the DOM. And that's because of this track by functionality that came in along with Angular Animate. I think specifically for something just like this. So what we've learned here is a little more about how the post method works and how you can build URLs on the fly, as well as how to invoke the delete method on HTTP to send the delete verb to the server. What we can do next is have a look at the Angular resource system and how we can use it instead of the Angular HTTP system. So far in this course, we've used $HTTP to connect to the server and to make requests to the server. And $HTTP is a fantastic resource to make use of the ground level HTTP protocol. And now you could use that to go and download all kinds of stuff. You can make requests using to any URL, using any verb you want. So it can be post, get, delete, whatever. You can also get back whatever data format you want. It doesn't need to be JSON. It could be XML. It could be HTML. It could be JavaScript. It could be whatever you want. But in reality, most of the time nowadays, when we're dealing with server stuff, we're dealing with REST-based web services. And that means that there's a particular URL schema layout. The way that the URL is formatted has a particular structure, very similar to the one that we built so far on the server side. And that it conforms to a particular verb structure. So get, for example, does a query, post creates a new object, delete deletes an object. And that the response is usually JSON, and it has a particular structure. So in order to make it easy to use that kind of service, the Google guys have come up with an Angular resource service. It's not part of the basic distribution nowadays, but it comes as part of what Yeoman gets you for free. And we can now port our code to try and see if we can make use of this system. It's a lot easier than writing the $HTTP stuff by hand. So let's just give it a try. Let's go over to the code and have a look. First, we bring in $resource. For the moment, we're going to leave $HTTP around. It's going to be, I guess, duplicitous, but that's fine. We'll take it out once it's no longer necessary. The first thing we want to do is define the task. And this is going to be an object that represents essentially the class of task objects presented by the server. So here we're telling the system that the task object has a particular URL layout and that the ID element, the task ID element maps to an ID that's returned from the server in the JSON blobs. Easy peasy, right? Okay, so let's go and now query all from the server using this new task class. We've got to run the server. We don't have anything yet, so let's add some. And let's reboot or refresh the page. Excellent. Still there. Okay, so this is working. Literally, that's it. Task.query. That is effectively the get all. Really cool, right? So now let's create a new task. In other words, build out a new one. So we got to respond to the scope add here. That's going to create one. Now we need to save it. Now in this case, the save just returns that it was correct. So now we need to update. All right, let's try this out. Okay, so let's have a look in the console. All right, interesting. Error in resource configuration. Expected response to contain an object, but got an array. Okay, let's have a look at the server code then. This is our server code. So here's what's happening. We're getting method post. Coming down here. And what are we returning? We are returning an array. We're returning all of the items in response to a post. And I guess it makes a certain amount of sense not to do that. So let's see. In this case, we just want to return the object. But here, we're not going to have that object yet, so let's return that. Object equals item. There you go. Let's reboot the server. Again, it's in memory, so we have nothing. Let's go and add some new stuff. And that works. Awesome. Very cool. Okay, so interesting. What we've done here is we've seen that there's been some issues on the server-side code and that it's not quite compatible with the $resource function. So we made some changes to the server to match that. And that's the really cool part about having control over both ends of the pipe, both the server side and on the client. If you run into problems where that's not possible, then you might want to roll back on $HTTP or see if there are some options on $resource that you can use to make it work for you. All right, let's finish this off. Let's see. Next thing to do would be to implement the done. And the way that we're going to do that is over here, and where we would be passing an ID, we're just going to pass in the to-do. Change this to to-do. Call $delete on it. And there's a small change here in that the promise return looks for then instead of success. Let's try this out. Great, that works. And finally, let's do save. We already have the to-do here, so let's just save it. Great, and that saves properly. One last thing, let's remove $HTTP. And does it still run? Yes, it does. Really cool, really good, really clean. I love how this looks now. It's a lot cleaner. It's a lot more object-oriented. All right, now I'll grant you that this example was pretty contrived. I had complete control over the REST interface, and so I wrote it pretty much exactly the way that would work best with Angular Resource, obviously given a few small hiccups there. With that being said, Angular Resource does have a lot of flexibility in how it makes its calls, what HTTP verbs it uses, and so on. And you should probably give it a try when you're wrapping a REST interface. Just try it to see if it works first. And if it doesn't, then you can always fall back on $HTTP. Also, there are different flavors of Angular Resource out there. One of my particular favorites, and this is because I'm a Rails guy, works very well with the Rails standard Rails REST interfaces. It's called Angular Rails Resource. So the next step from here is to look at componentization to make our little to-do app more organized and maintainable for you and your team. I admit to you that this is going to be one of my favorite parts of this course, because this is where I talk about all the different facilities that Angular provides to modularize your application. And modularizing your application is going to make it so much more easy to maintain, test, extend, document, reuse. It's fantastic. And the way that Angular provides common mechanisms for doing things like providing services, and in particular doing UI components, just really redesigns how we do front-end single-page application development. So I'm really excited about this section. I think you're going to really enjoy it. So let's start where we left off with the app that manages a simple to-do list on the server. And the last thing we did was move the API from the $HTTP system to the Angular resource system. So let's take that and refactor that into an API module that we can maintain and test separately and maybe even reuse. That's the kind of thing we're going to focus on in this segment, the modularity through the modules, the directives, the factories. All of these are tools that Angular provides you so that you can make your application more maintainable and more modular. And actually, you've been using them already, because if you look at app.js, right at the top, Yeoman has created for us the to-do app with some dependencies, like, let's see, the animate system, the cookie system, ng resource is where we bring in our $resource friend, ng route, which does routing, which we'll cover in the next segment, ng animate, which does all the slick animations and so on. And then in main.html, you can see that we use to-do.app, or index actually, right here, to-do app in the body. So in the beginning of the course, we're using ng app with a parameter because we didn't need our own app. But once you add dependencies like we have here with ng resource and the rest, then you need to add the app, which will hang off all of your directives and dependencies and filters and so on and so forth. Now, I don't want to build our API on the app module, the to-do app module. I want to create a new module called to-do and have a factory called API. Now, factories return objects that you can use in your application. I could use a service here. A service is a singleton. A factory is not. Whichever way you want to go, I'm going to choose a factory. So let's start by creating that to-do.js. Okay, factories return objects, so let's return an empty one to start. Now we got to go back to the index.html and include this on our page. So this is the specially comment out section that says used by Yeoman to figure out what scripts are included by the application so that you can use it later when it minifies the script files. You can just add, remove scripts as you like here. So I'm putting it before the app so that we can reference it in the app. Actually, let me go do that. Makes sense to me that we would do that. So let's go back to the app.js and reference it. And that's it. That's all you need to do to reference a new dependency, in this case, the to-do module. So let's have a look on the page. Nothing's going to happen. Refresh just to make sure. Yep. Nothing's happened, so there's no issues with the dependencies or anything like that. If there was, we would get an Angular error message in the console, and we would go debug through that, and the page probably wouldn't render the same way. So we'll go back to the factory and start porting over those functions. One by one, we'll start with a query function we'll call get. So here we're bringing in that task system at the top. Then we're doing the query, and we're going to have a callback function that then gets the to-dos as a callback parameter. So let's go and use that now. And that works. So now we ported our existing API, our existing UI, to use our new API. So it's probably a good time to talk about Angular's dependency injection. What is dependency injection? It's a big word. It's two words, actually, but it's really not that complicated. First is dependency. Our controller depends on three things: $scope, $resource, and API, right? Can't work without them, so dependent on them. Cool, so that's dependencies. Injection is just means that Angular will find the modules for you and depend on them, and then inject them into your function as arguments. You don't need to write code to go looking for them. Angular just manages all that for you. So dependency injection is the way that Angular makes it easy to get all the stuff that your code relies or depends on. All right, so let's keep on porting over this stuff. The next thing I want to do is port add. So this is going to take two parameters. The first is the piece of text to add, and then the second is that callback. So let's go and use that. Cool, that works. Let's port over delete. And let's make sure that works. It does. And finally, update. Yep, that's working. Okay, so we're ported, right? Everything looks great. We have our new API. Everything's really cool. But I'm not enamored of the callback stuff. It's pretty old school. The new school is to use promises. So let's bring in the $Q promise mechanism provided by Angular and change over this API to use promises instead of callbacks. So every time I want to create a promise, I actually have to create that promise. So let's start by doing that. The next thing I do is return it. And then when the promise is done, what you're going to do is call resolving it. Now we don't need a callback anymore, so let's get rid of that. Of course, this isn't going to work because there's no callback mechanism anymore, so let's go import that. So that promise returned an object. That object has a then method on it, and that then method is invoked with whatever you pass in to resolve. So let's go see if that worked. And it did. Much cleaner API, I think. All right, let's port the rest of these. Okay, these are all now ported over. Let's finish porting over these. Great, that looks awesome. Let's just make a few more fix-ups to deal with these JS hint issues. Everything looks good. Okay, so this has been a pretty big walkthrough of how to create a factory with an Angular module, and then how to move from callbacks to promises using the $Q Angular service. In the next segment, we're going to look into directives, which I think are the really fun parts, particularly if you like doing the UI side of things, what they are, and how they can help you modularize your UI. Directives are one of the reasons that I got into Angular. Not because the syntax of directives is pretty bad, but because of what directives can do for you. They can componentize your UI and make it easier to reuse and maintain UI elements. Really good stuff. So before I get into taking our app that we've already created and turning some of its elements into directives, let me just start out with some simple stuff just to get you going with directives, and we'll start from there. Okay, let's create a new directory. Create a simple file. Bring that up in Sublime. Let's go and open that. Bring it over into the browser. Okay. So let's bring in a simple Angular template and then add an app. And let's create a simple directive. This starts by calling the directive method on module. You give it two parameters, the name of the directive and the function that creates it. Just like other things, you can add scopes and things like that, or other dependencies that you need. This function then in turn returns a structure, contains some simple information about directive, the template, and so on. Well, let's just first make sure the page works. Okay, so let's create a template in there. And then invoke it. Nope, not working. So what's wrong here? Let's try this. Now that works. Okay, so what's going on here? So as it turns out, there are 3 ways to invoke a directive. Originally, I invoked it like an element, hello, as just the tag name. Now I'm doing it as an attribute. You can also do it as a CSS selector. I'm not going to go into that here. By default, a directive is restricted to being invoked by attribute. To make it work as an element, I can just add a new restriction to just have it be by element. So in this case, E for element. Let's save, refresh, and now it's gone. But if I do this, it's back. Nice, right? Now this template can be as complex as I like. Easy peasy. I can also make it either an element or an attribute or a class. I'm putting in A, in this case, for element and then attribute. So in this case, that works, but also close that off. That works as well. Now we have 2 highs. Make that a little bigger. All right, the next thing we can do is play with where templates are. You might have a very complex template. So let's have a look in here, directives. I could go and take this template, create a new file called hello.html. And it doesn't work because I'm loading the file off the file system. As you can see by this error, failed to load template hello.html. So to fix that, I could use a simple web server and then go to localhost 8000. And great, we have our template back. Okay, so another way to do this is to use a template text inside of a script tag. And this also works, but you notice that we don't actually go and get the hello HTML. It's coming out of this template. That's nice if you want to keep things local. If you want to load really fast, this avoids doing an AJAX fetch of the template. Okay, so how do we pass stuff into a directive, and what does scope mean in a directive? So it turns out directives have their own dedicated scope. So let's move the template stuff back into the directive and define a scope variable called name. Get rid of that. Add a comma. And that back to template. Okay, great. So now what we can do is we can say, hello, name equals Jack. Great. So what's with the @ symbol anyway? The @ symbol means literal, like the string Jack. There's also an equal sign, which means that you're bidirectionally binding yourself to another variable in the host scope. There's an ampersand, which indicates a callback, and will be used for implementing something like ngClick. We'll get to that when we wrap third-party controls in section 7. But let's look at what the equal sign means and work through that because it's pretty important. So we'll change that to an equal sign. We'll create a new controller. We'll connect this to controller. And now we'll bind name1 to name. Oops, I forgot to put the dollar on scope. And that works great. Create a second name. And just to show you that these two are actually dynamically binding, so it's bidirectional. Cool, right? Really nice. Now let's move this into the element. Let's also show what it looks like out here. So you can see you can change it from within the scope or change it from outside the scope, and it's bidirectionally coupled between the two. Okay, so one last thing. How do we get the scope to add methods and callbacks and stuff like that inside the directive itself? So what we want to do is investigate the link function. The link function takes 3 arguments. The first is the scope, the second is the element, and the third are the attributes. I'm just going to use scope here. So we can create a new thing, scope.high equals callback. And then from within here, we'll create a button. So now when we click on that, we're calling the scope high function, which is alerting the scope name, which is different depending on the directive that it's connected to. All right, so this is my introduction to basic Angular directive stuff. It gets you started, and what we'll do in the next section is show how to take the existing code that's in our to-do list application and turn it into directives. But for the moment, let's just get rid of this stuff and get back to our main app. All right, let's go back to our to-do list application and modularify it using directives. All right, let's go back to our to-do list application and use the directive stuff that we learned in the last section to see how we can directivize, if that's a word, our existing code. Okay, so we have this Angular module to do. Let's build on the to-do module by adding UI directives to that. Create a new file called to-do UI. And we'll bring that into the app. And now let's go take a look and see what might be a good target for modularization. One of the things that I see is this section right here, these to-dos, and we can go and modularify that. So let's go take this section, the button, the input, and make a to-do directive out of it. Okay, that's just the basics. Now we've got to pass in a to-do. So this is saying that the to-do attribute on the element is going to actually have the to-do. Let's paste in the template. Change those references to item. And now let's go back to the template. Say to-do equals to-do. And let's create a new one. Fantastic. But one of the reasons it's still working is because the save and done methods are in the host scope. So let's move those in to make the whole thing self-contained. A few more fix-ups to make. One, we need to add that API. And we can also get rid of these local connections to to-do. And now we also need to handle this update somehow. So let's emit an event for that. Let's go back over to the main and listen for that event. Awesome. Let's get rid of it. Fantastic. Great. Okay. So that's a fully modularized to-do element. Okay. So the next thing I want to directivize is this add functionality in here. So this is where we're adding a new element we're creating a new to-do. And that's this code right here. So let's take that whole thing and turn it into just an element. We know we're going to need that API eventually. And we're going to want to make it an element directive. It's going to have its own scope. And we'll paste in that template. Now let's use it first. This is how it works. Looks good, but it's not working because we don't have the scope all set up. So let's go do that. Great, let's give it a try. Fantastic. So now what if I wanted to go and add in some parameters to the new to-do? For example, the size of the text field. Let's give that a try. This is saying that size is going to be a literal, and the question mark after it means that it's going to be optional. So let's go and use this. This is basically setting the default parameter here. So I'm saying if you have specified a scope size, then take it. Otherwise, set it to normal. Now let's go and add this to the input. Let's have a look over here. Everything is good. You can say size equals extra large. And now it's super big. How cool is that? So let's just have a look at this for a second in the DOM. So you can see here that the new to-do tag is really part of the DOM. The browser just looks at it like a div in terms of styling and pretty much ignores it. But if you have CSS that depends on a certain layout for the DOM hierarchy, you may have some issues. So in that case, you want to look at the replace attribute on a directive that allows you to replace the original element with the contents of the template. Normally, this replace value is set to false, which is why the new to-do is still in the DOM. If you set it to true, then new to-do will be gone, and just the set of divs and the input will remain. As you can see, directives are a very powerful method for encouraging code reuse and for modularizing your application. I've shown two different directives here with different requirements that you can use as a basis for your work, if you like. We'll be going over directives extensively in the 7th section on bringing in third-party controls. Directives are one of the big reasons that Angular has the kind of popularity that it does. Nothing feels as good as dropping a fully featured control into a template and just knowing it's going to work. Mastering directives will take you a long way to mastering Angular. Next up is routing, which will take us one step closer to turning our to-do list app into a fully fledged single-page application. Single-page applications are becoming very popular, and for good reason. You can give a multi-page application feel without going back to the server for more full page refreshes. The page transition speed is great because you're not going back to the server to get more HTML. You may be going back to get some more data, but that's much smaller. Plus the fact that it works offline, depending on, of course, on how you implement that, but there's nothing in the way of you creating it so that it can be used offline. So what does being a single-page app mean anyway? Well, from a technical aspect, it means using the history API in the browser to build pages on the client without going to the server. So, for example, in our application, we might have a detail page for each task that we render completely in the browser. And why not? Let's just go give that a go and see where we get to. So as it turns out, Yeoman has helpfully already brought in the Angular routing system into our project. You can see that at the top of the app.js file, where we include the ng route. The first thing you want to do when you set up the routing system is to create some routes. There's a standard set that Yeoman provides. But of these, we need only two, the top and the bottom one. The one that defines the slash route here. This is our home page, which is rendered by main control. And then there's another one that says, unless you understand the URL, route to slash, which is home. So let's delete the stuff in the middle and create a new route for our detail page. The :id part of the URL means that the Angular system should take any parameter after the slash and map that to the ID parameter for the controller. That means, for example, that a slash with a 1 after it would map to the detail controller with the ID of equal to 1, /50 would map to the ID of 50, and so on. The rest of it is saying that we're going to use view detail URL as our HTML template, and we're going to use the detail control as our controller. So let's create that template. And now let's create that controller. And let's create an info controller that we're also going to use. And let's include that. And now one of the ways we can test it is just to go to the browser and try it. Okay, so this is mapping /ID10 to hi. Now the reason that there's a pound in there is an artifact of the fact that we're using client-side routing. We could use some server-side routing using the HTML5 history API. We're going to get to that in the third section here. Just hang loose. But for the moment, let's just use this # syntax. Now make that a little easier. Let's go and augment the directive that we had before to go and create an info button link on it. That extra stuff on the end, the class, is mostly just Bootstrap stuff. So now let's click on one of these. And yep, we're good. /3, /4. Awesome. Okay, so we're routing. Everything's really cool. Good so far. So let's build out some more of our template. We have our template all set up. Let's now go into our controller. We need the API because we're going to be using the API to go and fetch the to-do item. And we need the route parameters because that's the parameters defined on the URL that is sent to us by Angular. So let's first get that scope ID. It's as easy as that. Okay, so this is showing us that we have a parameter here of 3, and it's showing up as route params ID 3 here. We can change that to 50 if we want. No problem. Obviously, it's not going to be valid because that doesn't exist, but we don't know that yet. So let's go and get the item. Okay, so this is great and all, but we don't actually have a get one. We just have a get. So let's go and implement that. Let's copy this. And instead of query, let's use get. Then we need to find the task ID is ID. The rest all works fine. Let's go back over here and show the item text. Perfect. Hi. And super big. Awesome. Great. Let's give people a way to get back home, but also take out this. I also want to move this controller back up to a higher level. All right, let's give people a way to get back home. Test that out. Looks good. Now let's give people a way to edit it. Looks good. Now let's give people a way to save it or cancel. Cancel is just going to be going home. Save is going to be a button. Maybe a bit bigger. Look, needs a little padding, but whatever. So we now need to implement this save. So what do we do when we're done? Just send it back home. Let's give it a try. Perfect. Looking really good. So the reason these are updating is because the main control is getting relaunched, and that's going and doing the update against the server. Just to finish up, let's look at our JS hint issues. Missing a semicolon and scope is defined but never used. Get rid of that. Easy peasy. And to do UI is missing a semicolon, line 43. I'll give you that. Great. JS hint's clean. We have an app that's routing properly. It's really cool. Okay, so this was just an introduction to routing. So far, we've seen how to define routes and how to link those templates to a controller, how to read the parameters, and how to use the anchor tags and the window location to move around. In the next two segments, I'll go over resolving, which is a key feature of routing, as well as some of the events that are generated, and then finally, compatibility with the HTML5 history mechanism. Now that we have the basics of routing down, I'd like to introduce the resolve system. Resolve is something you associate with routes to preload all the information the view needs before it gets loaded. You define a set of promises for any of the different route parameters you want, and the view won't be loaded until all of the promises are resolved. For example, in our case, we have the ID coming into the detail view. So what we want to do is get the data for the to-do item before the view loads as part of the resolve. And then if it can't be loaded, maybe we shouldn't load the view in the first place. So the place to start is on the app, where we define a new key on the route called resolve, which in turn has one key for ID. The key is a function that takes the queue resource as well as the route and our API. From here, we create a promise. Which we return at the end. Then between the two, we get the item using the exact method that we had in the controller. But in this case, we change scope ID to the current params ID. And I've got to have some place to put it. So we're going to put this on a new thing called api.currentItem. And then we're going to resolve that promise. Next, we're going to add current item. And then we're going to go to the detail controller and use current item. Now let's see how this works. I've forgotten a comma over here. Let's fix that. Go into info, and now everything is preloaded before the view loads. So the net result here is the view won't be loaded until all the data is ready, which really doesn't make much of a difference when we're loading off of localhost, but it would make a huge difference if we're loading off the internet, and the API response speeds will vary dramatically in that case. But I'm still not totally happy with this implementation. Since the API already returns a promise, it seems rather silly to wrap one promise in another. So let's fix that by having the API remember its own current item, but now we need a concept of self. Put that in the wrong place. And so now all we need to do is this. But really, all we need to do is just API get one. Perfect, because API get one already returns a promise. So what did we learn here? We learned a way to postpone the view load until we had all the data ready for the view in memory. And that's really handy because, as I mentioned, sometimes APIs lag or hang. And if the view has already loaded but the data hasn't updated, the user is going to get an ugly user experience before the complete page loads. Plus, you're going to have to put in some logic to ensure that you don't get premature saves of empty data in an invalid way. That's just nasty. So with Resolve, you don't have to do any of that. It's just a really good thing. In the next segment, I'm going to wrap up our journey into routes with some information on how events are generated by the routing system and some discussion on how Angular uses the browser's history API. Now that we know how to do routing in Angular, and we know how to resolve for preloaded data, what else can we do with the router? Well, one thing we can do is listen to it. And that's that's a good idea in really large applications. Knowing when a user moves from one view to another is a good thing. So let's add some event listeners in. Now, the first way I want to do that is to create a controller right at the top level, right near the app definition. And save. Now I want to go and create that controller. At this point, we can go and look for some new events. So we'll just say that we got it, but also let's look at the data. And let's have a look. So here we can see we already had a route change and all the data about that particular object. We can go home, we get another route change success. Really cool. So this is telling us that the router is changing its routes as it rolls along. And what we can see is events coming in as I move through the UI. We can also look for a view loaded content event, which is generated by the ng view that is connected to the router. So one thing I didn't show was how this ng view is connected to the router. Put their content, the content of that control, into the ng view. So this ng view item is actually what's doing the magic of changing this middle section in here as we roll around between info and home. Cool, right? Go back into here, and now let's listen for some events from that. So we can see that we get both the route change and the view content loaded events as we click around. Now, another thing we want to look at is, remember when I talked about how the promises could possibly not work? Okay. So what happens there is you get a route change error. And I'm not going to show it here, but I'll show you how to subscribe to it. You change this to route change error. And you get one of these if those promises don't resolve properly. And you can do whatever you want at that point. But I'll be honest, it doesn't really make sense to put this all on a controller because we don't really need the scope here. So one thing we can do is change the controller instead of using a controller, let's use the run function. And run functions are important because it shows you how to actually put in some functionality that runs just when the application is loaded. Let's change this to run. Instead of running against controller, we're going to get here the root scope of Angular. So let's go and change all that to root scope, and then go back to the main index. Okay, so we're back to being good again, and we don't have that ancillary controller that we really didn't need. So you can think about using run for a whole bunch of different things, primarily setting up events, stuff like that. A good spot to put things that you need run only once on the initialization of the application. So one last thing to talk about, and that's the HTML5 history API compatibility mode. This allows you to use the regular slash URLs without the hash. So in this case, instead of #/1, it would just be /1. To do that, just add the location provider to the config in the app module. And then set HTML5 mode to true. Of course, your server needs to support vending the same single page app for all of the routes that you define in your application. And that's the really big trick with this particular problem. I'm not going to do that here. It really depends on the server technology and the server stack that you pick, how that's going to be done. This short segment covered two things. First, the events generated by the Angular routing system, and secondly, the HTML5 compatibility mode, which allows you to use real URLs and not the hash URL hack. With routing and views, you should be well on your way to making a real Angular single-page app. But before you ship your app, you want to test it thoroughly so you'll have confidence as you make changes to it, and that's what we'll be covering in the next chapter on testing. Testing is a very important piece of front-end development, and really of all development. And I don't mean manual testing, where you make a change to your code and then check it in yourself to see if it works. I mean a set of automated tests to make sure that everything works properly after every single modification. So what we're going to do over the next 3 videos is take a very simple application and build it out with unit testing and then end-to-end testing. And this first video is just going to set that whole application up. So let's start with Yo Angular. Okay, so now that we have that done, let's talk a little bit about testing. There are lots of ways to do testing, but the two I'll cover in this course are unit testing and end-to-end testing. Unit testing is where you test every unit of code, where in this case, it's probably akin to a module or a controller. So you write a controller, there's a certain set of logic to it. For example, if a button gets clicked, then a field is reset to some default value. And that functionality can be automatically tested anytime you like by executing the unit test that you write for it. End-to-end testing is a more complete test of the entire stack of the application. Sometimes, but not always, including the server. On the downside, end-to-end tests are usually a little slower to run than unit tests because they involve launching the browser, clicking buttons, maybe working with the server, whereas unit tests are more just around testing the logic of the app. So each has their advantage, but you want both because units of code don't work in isolation. They work in conjunction with each other to build an entire system. And if the user experiences a bug, they're not going to report it against a particular controller or a module. They're just going to say that the system is broken. So it's good to have unit tests that run fast and are a first sign of danger, and then end-to-end tests that give you that heartwarming feeling that everything is running fine. And if it's not clear already, you really want to be testing because of that heartwarming feeling that you're looking for. You want to be able to go home at night and know that your application is running just fine. And so when you make some big change, instead of just clicking around trying to remember all of those edge cases and hoping your coffee buzz doesn't wear off, you want to run automated tests that will tell you for sure if you missed anything or not. All right, I've prattled on long enough. Let's get to some coding. First off, there's a bunch of libraries that we need to install. The first is Karma Jasmine. Now there's two systems running here. The first is Karma, the second is Jasmine. Karma runs the test, and Jasmine is a set of utilities that allow you to describe the test. Things like what you expect for values, what the individual tests are, that sort of thing. There's a third system called Grunt, which we've been using so far as to run the server and do things like that. There's also build and other things that Grunt does. So let's also install Karma. There's also a system called Karma Coverage that does code coverage. It tells you how much of the system in terms of percentage your tests are testing. And finally, there's something called Karma Chrome Launcher. This isn't required quite now, but this is for the end-to-end tests coming down the line. This is going to help us launch Chrome automatically. I use Chrome. You can use pretty much whatever browser you want, but I prefer Chrome. So we're going to use Chrome in this course. The next thing we're going to do is hack the grunt file a little bit, just in the beginning, to set up the unit tests such that they're distinguished from the end-to-end tests that we'll add on later. So let's go and take a look at the grunt file. And go down here where we see that it's already set up a testing system. This is unit tests, but I want to be clear about it. So we'll make it test unit. And then that will invoke Karma unit, which is defined here. So here's a set of the Karma configuration file that tells Karma exactly what it's going to run, what the tests are, where the tests are located, and so on. Let's go take a look at that file. So here we're saying that it's got Jasmine as a framework. These are the files. It's going to run on this port. It's going to be run by Phantom.js, which is a headless browser. That's going to make it really fast. It is a single run is false currently, so it will only run once. Whatever, that's fine. But let's run this and see what actually happens. Okay, now I want to point out that this executed 2 of 2 tests already. We haven't written any code. So where are these tests coming from? Well, that's part of what Yeoman has built for us already. Let's go back to the editor and have a look in test spec controllers. So there's actually 2 controllers that are built automatically. The first is about, the second is the main controller. Each one of those just has this really simple set of awesome things, and the test just checks whether that set of awesome things has 3 elements in it. So why does that work? Well, let's go back to the app and take a look. So you can see that in this case, the about control has a set of awesome things, and there's 3 in there. Let's make a change. Make that 4 and see what happens. We'll run the test again. And we get a beep and an error. Expected 4 to be 3. Great. Now we can fix our test. Run it again. Awesome. And now this is telling us that those tests have passed. Okay, so we're all set up now for our unit tests, which is going to take us on to the next video. So I know there was a lot of setup here, but there is a payoff. Believe me, once you get the hang of testing and you start using it, your life will be changed forever. In the next segment, we'll make use of the configuration that we just did here by creating a very small application and then doing unit tests and end-to-end tests on it. Okay, picking up where we left off. Now that we have everything set up, we want to start doing some unit testing, and that means building out a small app that we can start working with and playing with. In this case, again, I'm going to use a to-do list. Let's start the server. And over here, we're going to run unit tests. Still working fine. Okay, so let's make some changes to the app. First, I'm going to remove this header. Don't really need it. Get rid of the footer too. Now that's gone. Go in here and get rid of the Jumbotron. Up here, we'll go and create an unordered list. And then within that, we'll have our list of to-do items. We'll have an input box where a person can add a new task. And finally, we'll have a button where they can add it. And then what we really need is a controller. Now I'm going to create that controller. But I'm not going to put anything in it, and here's why. So we're going to use test-driven development to build out this controller. And what test-driven development says is you don't write any code until you have a test to test whether that code would work. So we're going to start by building out a test that would expect these scope items at this point to be of length null. There's going to be an items array, and that's going to hold some items. It should be empty to start with. So let's go build out a test for this controller and then add in that test. I'm just going to copy and paste this. Change out main control to be to-do controller. And we're going to say should have no to-do. So we expect there to be a scope items, and it should be of length 0. We'll call this to-do.js. It's testing the to-do controller. Now, interesting to note, over here, we are running it, right? So we don't actually have to have two windows side by side. We're running the unit test every single time that we're building out the application. But it's nice to be able to see that we have this already. And we can go over here and do the same thing, and it's metric. The reason it's not finding a to-do controller is that I didn't save this file, so let's save the file. Okay, so it's saying undefined is not an object. So scope.items.length. Why is that undefined? Because scope.items is undefined. So let's go and define. Head back over here. Looks like the test's all passed. Let's check it again manually. Great. Executed 3 of 3 now with success. So we have the 2 ones that came with Yeoman before, and now we have the third one that our own test that we built out. Now the next thing we want to do is test to make sure that the task itself is blank. So let's write the test first. So we expect the task to be an empty string. Run that. And what do? We expect that to fail. So let's see it fail. It indeed did fail. So now let's write the code to make it work. We drive the development using the test, TDD. Here. Great. Cool. Now we have 4 of 4 that are successful. Light is green, trap is green. Awesome. Okay, let's continue on a little bit. Now we want to add the functionality that would add that task to the to-do list. So let's go and create this test for add, and then we'll go and create add. Let's see, it should add a task. We're going to start by saying this should be 0. Then we're going to set the task to foo. And we're going to add it. And now we expect the items to be 1. And we expect that the first item will be foo. Okay, undefined is not a function, scope.add. Let's go and add that. Is that enough, Mr. Test? No? Take a look. Well, it's a different error. Now it's 0 expected to be 1 and undefined expected to be foo. So let's fix that by going and doing what this should do. Let semicolon, just make sure you have int happy. And run the tests. Fantastic. Executed 5 of 5. Successful. So now we built the UI using test-driven development. Let's have a look and see if it actually works. Kind of interesting side note. And indeed it does. Cool. Awesome. Okay, now I know this probably seems a little plodding and pedantic, and believe me, sometimes it's just that. But what test-driven development gives you is that you have the confidence that everything in the code is checked, and one minor change that alters the behavior will get picked up. Now, whether you want all that granularity or not is up to you. Believe me, when you have all those tests, and that tests document the behavior of the system well, and changing code alters the behavior and creates unthought of side effects, you're going to thank your lucky stars that you spent all that time developing those tests. So the next video is going to cover end-to-end tests, which are really cool because you get to see the browser pop up with Karma results, and it gets automated, and you have a lot of fun with that. So let's dig in there. So end-to-end testing is where you automate the browser so that it acts like someone entering text or clicking on buttons. Now, I want to put a big caveat emptor on this particular video about this topic, in that it's a point in time. And what I'm saying is, I wrote, for example, the script of this video about 2 months before I recorded it, and within that time, there were enough changes that I had to make a whole bunch of technical changes to how the code was written and working that it was a big pain. So just watch out with these particular types of tests. It involves a lot of different systems and a lot of different choreography. So if it doesn't work for you, then hit Stack Overflow and the rest of it and push through it. But it will change over time. So I think what you need to get out of this video is kind of a larger sense of how it can be done and what it does, rather than the bits and the bytes in particular of how it works at this particular moment in time. Okay, so off of my caveat, let me tell you a little bit about E2E. So end-to-end, it's valuable because it provides a smoke test for the entire stack and gives you a lot of confidence in the system itself is working as a user would use it. The downside, of course, is that it's strongly coupled to the UI. So to the extent that the UI might change its presentation in some way, but still remain valid from a user perspective, it might break the end-to-end tests that depend on particular IDs or classes or things like that. All right, so I'm going to go back to the grunt file.js and modify that to support the end-to-end tests. So first off, we need a new task. I'm going to do a little copy and pasting here. This is our new test E2E. It's basically the same thing as test unit, but in the exception that it's going to run Karma E2E. So let's go have a look at Karma. And we're going to need to define that. So the only change here is going to be that we want to use Karma E2E.conf.js instead of Karma.conf.js. Probably haven't looked at it yet, so let's go look at that. So what Karma.conf does, is set up the whole testing system. So in this case, the frameworks, the files, the port we're going to be using, browser that's going to run the test, plugins, and so on and so forth, logging info, and the rest of it. This was all set up for us by Yeoman, and it's pretty much all right? We ran the test, and there was no problem with it. So that's great. Now we need to go and do the same sort of thing for the E2E tests. Let me go bring in that. And we can take a look at these. So pretty much the same thing with some differences. One, we're going to use ng scenario instead of Jasmine here. We're going to have a much smaller set of files. Port's going to remain the same. We're going to run Chrome without security, and that's going to be defined here in custom launchers. We're going to use the Karma Chrome launcher and Karma ng scenario. And then we're going to have proxies that proxy the server to make the requests. It's a little hairy, as I say. There's a lot of moving parts in here, but it does work. And so that's really cool. Okay, let's save that. And let's try that out. Now, I expect this to fail because there's no test E2E directory that contains the tests. And indeed, it did fail because there's no E2E directory that creates the test. But there was a Chrome launch, and we'll get there. And that's really cool. So let's go and start building out the test. So this is going to be our test bed for the to-do app. And the first thing we need to do is tell the browser to navigate to /. And it needs to do that before every single test. Now, the first thing we want to test is whether we can add a task. But really, all I wanted to do at this point is just pause so that we can see what's happening. Now, when you tell it to pause, what you get is this. And you can hit resume when ready. But it shows you the UI as the test runner sees it. Now, normally you don't see it. Oh, and it also times out after a little while and disappears. But that was cool, right? So now we see that it's actually connecting to the app. It's running it in a little frame. That's good. That's a really good start. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to set up an expectation that in the beginning, the number of LI elements is 0 because there's nothing there yet. So let's set that in there. Now, big caveat emptor here. There are actually two different types of systems going on here between unit tests and E2E tests, and they both use a similar syntax. So in this case, they both use this expect. Remember that we had in unit tests, we had expect like this. Expect some value to be something like that. Yeah, easy enough. Here it is the similar syntax, expect to be such and such, but it's a completely different system with different inputs. Jasmine, which we used for the unit tests, is defined here on Jasmine GitHub. The ng scenario stuff, which we're using to drive the end-to-end tests, is defined over on Angular. And it also shows all the expect and everything else, right? Okay, so again, two different systems, so you really got to watch out. Okay, so back to the story at hand. We expect that there won't be any LIs to start with, but what we want to do is type into the task some new item. Let's have a look at that. Run it, see what happens. Cool, right? So whatever we typed into that enter field actually goes into the field itself. We're literally automating the browser. That is really, really cool. So the next thing we need to do is click that button, right? Look for the button element. Once we have it, we'll take that element and we'll click it. And we'll call this done because it's an asynchronous thing and you need to call back done so that it actually does something. But let's pause here, see what happens. Really cool. So we've clicked the button and now we've added a new item. So now all we have to do is just make sure that that got done. So what? We expect that the number of LI items is going to be 1 at this point. And let's get rid of that pause. And in fact, yes, that number of elements is 1. We have a successful test. We're done. It is super cool. All right. I really just wanted this to be a very simple intro into end-to-end testing. I don't mean to show all the different elements of it. You can go and go hog wild with the browser however you want. But the most important part is that you basically have a smoke test that checks the entire happy path of the application and any mission critical edge cases that you think you need to get in there. Now, I don't mean to belittle this stuff at all. There's obviously an entire profession around this, so that one 8-minute talk or so isn't going to give you everything you need to know. But it's sufficient to say that the application is mostly about entering text and clicking buttons and examining the results, which a lot of applications are. So you should have no trouble at all building an end-to-end test around it. Okay, so I hope these videos on testing encourage you to invest in building automated tests for your app. Common estimate is that it adds about 20% of time to building your application. But I can tell you from experience that what it really saves you from is some gray hairs and stress. No amount of manual testing is ever going to give you that same feeling of assurance in the stability of your code as having a full set of automated regression tests. So somewhere along the line, you're going to want an Angularified version of a third-party component. In this section, I'm going to go over how to integrate third-party components written for Bootstrap, D3, and jQuery. Each segment will cover a different technology and demonstrate some of the different challenges you'll face in integrating each of these fully into your Angular application. Let's start off with Bootstrap. Bootstrap is the UI framework we've been using so far, but so far we haven't been using any of the JavaScript components. In this section, I'm going to Angularify the modal dialog component just as a demonstration. You really won't need to do this because there's already an Angular Bootstrap library that wraps all these components, but it's good to see how it's done. So let's start off by building a basic Angular Bootstrap application using Yeoman. Okay, we're good to go. Now, when I do this, I like to start by doing the task without Angular and then port the code over to Angular. And that way I know it works first in my environment before I try to turn it into a directive. So let's start by adding a dialog into the main.html template. So this is just the standard test template for a dialog from the Bootstrap documentation. I've just copied and pasted it in here. So now we need to add a button so that we can launch it. This is just a button that calls the launch method on the scope. So we need to now implement that launch method on the scope. And now let's refresh the page and see the launch button. And we click it, and we get the modal pop-up. Very cool. So, well, depending on where you want to go, maybe you've actually done it already. You're completely done, but I want to turn this into a directive so that it's more general purpose. So I'm not done. So let's go back into the AngularJS application at this time and add one seriously long piece of directive. Okay, so I've started off by creating a new directive called modal, and it's defined by this directive function. It returns this structure. The structure has certain elements. One of those is the restrict element that says whether it's going to be an element or an attribute. In this case, I've chosen E for element. It's got a scope. The scope says what the scope values coming in are going to be. In this case, it's going to be title, which is the title of the dialog, visible, whether the dialog is visible or not, the template for the dialog, which in this case is going to be this dialog.html file, transclude, and then the link function. Link function is going to get called when the directive is created. But transclude is a really interesting one here. Transclude is just a big word that basically means that you want this element to wrap other elements. So we'll be able to wrap the dialog tab, the modal tag, around a bunch of interior tags that will then form the content or the body of the dialog. So cool, right? So now let's finish off that link function. Okay, so now the link function is going to set all this up. First, it's going to get the dialog element and store it by doing scope.dlg element equals the jQuery stuff, the JQLite stuff. It's then going to set the default values of title and visible. It's then going to watch the visible scope element to see if it's changing, and when it changes, either show the modal or hide the modal, depending on where it's getting changed to. And then it's going to define two functions in it, scope close and scope save, both of which, in this case, just close the modal. Okay, so now we've got almost everything ready to go. We just need to go and get dialog.html together. And one of the easiest ways to do that is just to wrap the HTML in the template in another script tag, which is of type textng template. So let's go do that. So this is one way to create a template in Angular. The other is to actually have a file on the server called dialog.html, and then have Angular will go and get that and use it as the template. This way is just a little bit easier. It's also a little bit faster in that you don't have to go and make another request to the server to go get dialog.html. So let's make some more tweaks to set up the title. Now, the next thing we want to do is actually use the modal dialog. So let's go over and create a new controller and then create a dialog that it's going to create. All right, now let's go create that controller. And this just simply sets up a shown scope variable and a launch function that sets the shown to true. And just to make things a little less confusing, let's go and remove the original launch function. And let's save it and try it out. So pretty cool, right? And it's a nice, clean API. The title goes in the tag attributes, the visible flag goes in a linked scope variable, and whatever we put in the modal tag becomes the contents of the dialog. And we can close it, and it disappears perfectly, and that's because of the code in the directive for the scope value. But I do want to add one more thing, and that's the optional callback on the press of the save button. So let's add that to the directive, then set a default value for it. So this basically says if we don't get a function, then we just define it as an empty function that does nothing. And finally, as far as the directive goes, let's go and add that call to the save method. And then go and add it to the dialog itself. And then back to the controller. And let's try it out. Awesome. We click on it and it pops up. Everything's cool. So what have we done here? We've taken an off-the-shelf Bootstrap component and turned it into an easy-to-use directive that you can just pop into your application really easily. If you want, you could even wrap this new module and post it on GitHub and make your name in the world as a person who can wrap third-party components in Angular directives. Seriously, though, this is a pretty valuable technique, particularly for isolating your Angular application from a dependency on any particular third-party library. I do want to encourage you to think a lot about the transclude functionality I've shown here. It's an extremely powerful feature of Angular directives, and it's cool to think about everything you can do with it. Next up is wrapping a D3 visualization as an Angular directive. So let's get cracking on that. In the last segment, I showed how to wrap an Angular directive around the Bootstrap modal component. In this segment, I'm going to bring the cool with D3. If you're not familiar with D3, you need to be. I've been doing this so long that I come from a time when you actually need to convince people that computers were cool and applications were cool. So I understand the value of a good visualization. And that's just what D3 does. So let's have a look at some examples of D3 visualizations to whet your appetite. This is the D3 landing page at d3js.org. From here, you can click onto the examples page and have a look at some of the examples of just what D3 can do. And it's pretty impressive. D3 is a library designed to make these visualizations easy to write. It was written by Mike Bostock. Most of the actual visualizations you hear were written by him as well. And you'll see a lot of his stuff on the New York Times. Really beautiful stuff and interactive as well. Let's have a look. As you can see from the zooming, you don't see any jaggies. And that's because to create the visuals, he's using the Scalable Vector Graphics format, or SVG for short. And he's using that instead of the canvas tag. Where the canvas tag deals in pixels, SVG deals with lines, arcs, fills, and so on. So it's up to the browser to render those lines at the highest possible fidelity, and render them it does with beautiful results that work well on desktop, tablet, or mobile. Anyway, enough of the cool and enough sell. Let's get cracking on taking one of these visualizations and using it in our Angular application by wrapping it in a directive. Now I'm going to pick one of the simpler ones. This speedometer here. And the reason that I'm picking that is it's relatively simple and will make for a shorter screencast. There's nothing stopping you from picking one of the bigger, shinier, cool ones. The first thing we need to do is build a new host application. So we're going to do the Yo Angular thing and create that application. The next thing to do is to add D3 to the project. I'm going to use Bower install to do that. Here I've specified version 3.43, and the -- save makes it automatically add in the reference into the bower.json. So let's start up the application. Looks good so far, so the first thing I need to do is bring in the CSS from the D3 page and copy it into our CSS. Done. So let's go back again and grab the script tags and the links to the Google font and copy them and plunk them into our index. Looks good. Let's go back to that for a second. Now I could stop here and ask what all this stuff is, but really I don't care. I look at this as a 3-step process. First, I get it to work in my environment, and that means bringing it all in regardless of what it is. Then I convert it to Angular using a directive. Then finally, I see if there's anything that I want to change. In this case, I might change the Google font or this dependency on IOP control, whatever that is. Anyway, you can do step 2 and 3 in whatever order you want, port and clean, or clean and port. Your call. For this screencast, I'm just going to port through and leave the clean as an exercise left to the reader or listener. All right, so let's bring in the span and the script for the visualization itself. And get rid of that part at the top. Perfect. So let's look at the D3 code, or at least as much of it as references the span, which it does right at the top. So that's where we're first going to want to connect to this thing. So let's create a directive. We'll call it speedometer. So I've used restrict to make it an element. I've given it a template div. You can use a span, a div, whatever you want. Your call. Next, I'm going to create an update function and just paste the D3 code in there and then call update at the end. I do need to make one small change, and that's to empty out the element first. As well as reference the element. So why do I need to empty it? Because otherwise it would just keep adding more and more gauges to the div each time an update method was called on this directive. So let's replace that span with a reference to the directive. And boom, an Angular-based speedometer. Not bad. But what we really want, is be able to change the values on the speedometer by changing their scope values. Let's go back and take a look at the code. So the first thing we need to do is look at the code and notice that the gauge and the seg display variables are the things that we want to be able to update when the scope values change. So let's turn those into scope variables. And let's add some scope variables for the current speed and the number of miles. And let's change the hard-coded values to those. And finally, let's put some watches on those speed and miles values. Okay, let's refresh the page just to make sure everything looks like it's still rocking and rolling. Cool, I had to fix one small issue there with the scope gauge. So the next step is to create a new controller so that I can create the speed and miles scope values that I want to attach to the speedometer. As well as add a button that allows me to go and change those values, show that it can work. And let's go make that controller. Here I'm just adding on some random values to speed and miles to indicate some sort of change. Now let's give it a try. So very cool, but the miles aren't changing, but that's probably because I messed up on my scope definition down here. Scope miles, save that, go back here. Yep, perfect, works great. Okay, so what have we learned? We've learned that D3 is cool, and we've learned that it's pretty easy to integrate it into our Angular applications, at least in so much as this particular visualization was easy to integrate. Well, anyway, did I mention it was cool? Anyway, our next target is a jQuery component, and even if you don't want to do that, you should stick around for it because it shows you how to handle event callback, and that'll be useful for your D3 visualizations as well if they have mouse or keyboard handlers, because the way that you do that is the same for both D3 and jQuery. In the last two segments, we covered how to integrate Bootstrap components and D3 visualizations with your Angular application. In this last segment, we're going to get into how to do this for jQuery and to show some different aspects to writing good directives. So let's start up with an empty directory and yo Angular. Okay, we have our application all set up and ready to go. Let's bring up the server. Great, that looks good. So the jQuery component that we want to use is a jQuery UI component. Let's go to the jQuery UI project. And the jQuery UI project is a set of widgets packaged up to work with jQuery that do the standard sort of things: date picker, dialog menu, so on and so forth, progress bar. For this particular example, I'm going to use the jQuery spinner. Under jQueryui.com/spinner, you can put in a value. You can spin up spin down, pretty standard sort of stuff. Okay, so let's go and bring that into our project. Kill the server. So I've installed jQuery UI using Bower. We'll serve it up again. Great. Still working. Cool. So let's now go and include the jQuery UI CSS in our project. Save that. Check on the browser. Everything looks good. Excellent. All right, so again, the first step is to go and bring it in like you'd see from the website, in this case jQuery UI, and then to Angularify it and build the directive around it. So let's first start with some basic jQuery UI code. And refresh the browser and have a look. Set to the 10. Up, down, super easy. So all you need to do is define an input and then run the spinner method on it. So let's go and build out a controller and a directive. I'm going to first start by instantiating them. Now I've defined here that there's going to be a spinner controller and there's also going to be a spinner directive. So let's go in and build that out. That about does it for the controller. Let's go and build the directive. All right, I built out the spinner directive. This is going to be an element directive as specified by the restrict. It's going to have a value on it within the scope. It's going to have a template, which is just the input tag. And then in the link function, we're going to run that spinner method on that input element. So let's go check it out. Yep, refresh, and that works. Very cool. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is set the value of the spinner. Cool. Now it's got 50 in there. Awesome. Loving jQuery so far. So now the question is, when it changes, how are we going to go and update the scope variable to match that? So what we want to do is listen for the spin event on the spinner, and that's coming from jQuery UI. So now every time jQuery UI updates the value, it sends along this spin event that's got this UI value in it, and then we're going to set the scope to that value. Let's save that. Everything looks good, but how do we really know that that value is getting set? So let's put that into the template and see what actually happens. So as expected, it starts at 50. Now let's go up. That's not working. So what do we need to do? Well, let's make sure that we're getting called back first. So let's put in a console log. And we'll come over here. So it looks like we are getting called. Okay, so one thing that we can do is we can use the scope apply function to go and tell Angular that there has been a change. So let's go and see how that works. Refresh. Now it's working. So what's happening here is that Angular needs to be notified that there's been a change to the scope. It's not seeing those events from jQuery, so you need to notify it. And one of the ways to do that is to use scope.apply. Another way to do that is to use root scope and digest. So let's go see how that's done. Okay, that works too. So what's the difference between these two? Root scope is the root scope of all of the scopes within Angular. And what you're telling Angular by telling it to digest is that there's been a change somewhere, who knows where, but somewhere deep in all those scopes, there's been a change and it needs to go and reevaluate all of the scopes, which is kind of excessive. So really the way that I like to do this is to use that scope.apply. It's very clean, it's surgical, it tells Angular exactly what's going on and where that's going on. So let's go and go back to that. The last thing I want to do is turn this into an attribute directive. It really doesn't make sense to be an element directive, so let's change that. First off, let's change the restrict E to a restrict A, and then change this to element 0. Because now the directive isn't creating the input, it's actually just going to use an input that's already existing, so we can get rid of the template as well. Save that. Go over here. Now we'll make that a spinner, an input that has the spinner on it. And it still works. Great. This is a bit more appropriate in terms of an API for this particular control. What you're doing is augmenting the functionality of an existing control with some new behavior. You're not actually creating a new control. So it's just a nice API and is appropriate to use it in the spinner context. So we learned an important new part of integrating with third-party libraries here, and that's how to handle interactivity, handling when the user clicks on something in a third-party control that Angular itself is unaware of. And we've also seen about how to use attribute directives instead of an element directive, as we showed in the other examples. I hope this shows you how Angular can play nice with other libraries, and that you should be wrapping those libraries in directives so that they can work seamlessly in the Angular ecosystem. We've worked with Bootstrap a lot in this course, but we actually haven't used the full features of Bootstrap to any real degree. So what is Bootstrap anyway? It's a responsive UI framework, which means that it's a combination of CSS and JavaScript that uses the media query features built into CSS3 to provide a good look and feel across cell phones, tablets, and the desktop. And all of that from the same HTML. So you write your HTML once, and it works across all three, which is the really big value proposition of responsive design. There are a bunch of responsive frameworks out there, notably one like Foundation is another popular framework, but Bootstrap is very popular and well respected. So when I say that we really haven't used it all that much, what do I mean? Well, we've been using some of the layout stuff with row and columns, but besides that, we haven't used a lot of the... So when I say we haven't used it all that much, what do I mean? Well, we've used a lot of the layout stuff with the rows and the columns and whatnot, and we've used a modal dialog, but we haven't dug it really any deeper into any of the other features of Bootstrap, or seen how Angular makes them much easier to use. So let's remedy that by starting a new application. All right, with that done, let's launch the server. And it looks like that's running okay. So let's go grab the Angular Bootstrap UI toolkit. So here's the Angular directive project, angularui.github.io/bootstrap. And as you can see, as we roll down, there's a whole bunch of the different components, carousel, collapse, date picker, and so on. So how do we get that into our project? Well, we use Bower. Great, now we have that installed. Let's go grunt serve again. Cool. Now let's start with something easy, the date picker control, for instance. We'll go over to the app. Okay, now that should have worked. So let's go take a look at the page. Date picker, let's make sure that we did it right. We'll go over to JavaScript, markup. Okay. Date picker, that looks right. So what's the problem here? The problem is that we didn't go and include the UI Bootstrap module in our app. So let's go fix that. Fantastic. Cool. So now we have it. And I want to make sure that we're actually getting something in that start variable. So let's take a look. Fantastic. Now let's reformat that as a date. Perfect. But I really don't like this week stuff on the side. Is there a way we can get rid of that? Yes, there is. So let's go back here and see that there are options. Picker settings. And within that, you can see that there's a bunch of different things. I'll take show weeks, which defaults to true, and set that to false. And now no more weeks. Perfect. So the date picker is a really good example of using an element directive in Angular with a set of attributes to wrap a Bootstrap component or another component. It's a good example of how you would want to do this for not only your own stuff, but how these should be done in general. All right, now another thing that I've noticed is a pain, at least when I'm working with apps, are tabs. So let's go and try out tab sets. Pretty cool stuff here, right? So how are we going to do that? Let's go back over to the code. And we start off by defining a tab set. Cool. And now we have a tab. But, you really want multiple tabs. That's really nice. And honestly, this wouldn't have been as slick without the Angular stuff. This particular directive does a really good job of managing state between the tab set and the tab, as well as doing all the transclusion work inside the tab directive. So well played all around here on the design of the directive in general. All right, so what's next? So radio buttons are sometimes a pain, particularly with all the frameworks like this one, like Bootstrap, that don't actually use input controls for the radio buttons. Bootstrap uses buttons that are given very specific roles to set their behavior. So let's try out some radio buttons, and that starts with building a button group. All right, so what we have here is a set of radio buttons, all within the button group, and each has a different value. That value is either A, B, or C. We can then select that. Pretty cool. And we can also set that as the current value, saying scope val equals B, like that. Really cool. So what else can we do? Another thing I see a lot is a type ahead input, and this library makes that super easy. Let's just drive the data out of the scope in this case, but you can drive it off a service if you like. So in this case, the type ahead directive is an attribute directive on input. Okay, so currently we don't have any states to drive the type ahead here. So let's go and define that in the scope. Awesome. So now we have a type ahead control driven right out of the scope. Of course, you could use the server if you want to go and get that data and to drive that. That's completely up to you. Really sweet, really easy, and definitely a good example of how to use an attribute directive to augment the behavior of a control. So one last thing, and this is really just for me. In every book I've ever written, there are always pictures of my daughter. So I had to figure out a way to get that in here. And the way that I'm going to do that is to show it using a carousel control and connect that to some images. So the first thing I need to do is get some images into the project. And we can see these images over in the images directory, pics 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to add a carousel control to the project. So within the carousel, there's going to be a number of slides. And then for each slide, there's going to be a number of images. So currently, we don't have any images in there, so nothing's getting shown. So we need to define that in the scope. And there you have it, an easy dynamic carousel courtesy of Angular Bootstrap and the Bootstrap library. Of course, admittedly, I have some gratuity in this example, but it does show how easy it is to use standard Angular directives like ng repeat in conjunction with these new custom directives. So, wow, a lot to see there. And there's still a lot more that you can do with Bootstrap. Bootstrap basically covers everything you need to do with an app. And it does so in a really nice, responsive, and good-looking way straight out of the box. And what we've seen here is that the Angular library makes the Bootstrap stuff even easier to use. So I strongly encourage you to use Bootstrap in your application, or at the very least, a responsive framework of some variety. The time when we could just ignore phones and tablets and concentrate on just building for the desktop is definitely gone. It is definitely a mobile world out there. Internationalization is a huge deal in application development nowadays. Emerging markets are a great place to sell software, and what sounds like a big hairy deal of I-18N is usually just comes down to just replacing a bunch of strings based on language and doing different date and number formatting. And the date, number, and currency formatting are handled by Angular already, so that's a big part of the battle right there. So what you're really doing is looking at just the string replacement stuff. And what does that entail? Basically, it means that all the strings used by the application will be stored in a table, one table per language, and then referenced in that table by a symbol. For example, if an English string is hello world, then there'll be an entry in the symbol table, hello in all uppercase, or hello underscore world in all uppercase. I mean, it depends on your system and how your company decides to do it. But there'll be one constant hello world symbol, and that'll be translated into all the different languages in the different tables. Then later on, as more translations are added, the UI will just use whatever the string is for hello world or that symbol in whatever the current language is in that slot and display that to the customer. Now, at the time I put this video together, there was no standard way to do this in Angular. So we're going to bring in a library written by Pascal Precht called Angular Translate. And let's start by building an application. And let's install that library using Bower. And start up the server. Okay, cool. So the first thing we need to do is reference that library. And then we need to configure it. Now, in this case, what I'm saying is I'm defining the English or EN version of the string. And in this case, the hi everybody is going to translate into hi everybody. So let's go and use this. And we see it in the browser and nope. Okay, that didn't work. So what's happening here is that the library doesn't know which language I'm currently operating in. So let's set that back in the config. And there you go. Okay, so now we have our preferred language set to English. But let's say that we want to do this at runtime. How do we do that? So let's go over to the controller and actually set the language. And that works too, but how do we know that that actually changed anything? Let's go and create another translation. In this case, I'm going to create a new German version of it, DE for Deutschland. So let's go back to the controller and now set that to German. Awesome. Guten Tag, which isn't exactly hi everybody, but it's pretty close. So let's have one last thing, and let's try and create a value here on the app, which is something that you might put in your script tag on the page called language. And so we're now setting a global value on the app called language. We can take this and use it here, just inject it as a dependency. And now we're back to English again. Easy peasy. So what we've seen here is just one element of the puzzle of getting a complete internationalization solution into an app, but it's a very, very important one. Why is it important to learn? Because as we move towards more single-page applications, the burden of internationalization is going to fall increasingly on the client side of the equation, and that's where we're operating here. So learning how it's done and getting experience with some library, even if this isn't going to be the particular production library for internationalization for Angular, is important. And once you get the hang of internationalization concepts like this one, it really isn't such a scary thing. Rarely does internationalization ever mean changing the logic of the application. So get in there and build some internationalizable applications and make some money overseas. One thing we haven't covered yet is Angular's robust support for client-side form validation. It's actually a lot easier and more convenient than you might think. Certainly a lot easier than you're used to if what you've done previously is to write all this stuff by hand. So let's get started with a simple example app. Now this is the point where I'd usually bower in another library. The really cool thing here is that I don't have to, because all this stuff is already built into Angular. So let's just start up the server and get going. Okay, that looks good, but we don't need any of it, so let's get rid of that. And let's go over here. Get rid of all of that. Perfect. Now the first thing we want to do is start with a form. Angular does its validations against forms, so you need one. So let's go build one. And then within that, let's create two simple fields, first and last name. Looks good. So let's set up some scope variables for the first and last name. Awesome. And now let's see. Let's get rid of that. So we have the variables, but not any contents. Cool. And now let's add a submit button, but let's only enable a submit button if there's actually some content in those values. So what we're saying here is disable this field if either the first or last length is 0. So in either case, that's going to be disabled, still disabled, not disabled. Cool. All right. Now the problem here is this is great and all, but what happens when I want to add more fields or more complexity? It's just going to keep getting larger and larger and larger, and I'm going to need to maintain all that. So let's try something else. So first, let's go and add a required field to each one of these, because they're required, right? You need a first and last name. Now this is just starting to get into Angular validation. So now what happens when I hit submit? Awesome. Errors. Done automatically for you by Angular. How cool is that with almost no coding at all? That's really awesome. But now we want to add some visual indicator that these fields actually are required. So how do we do that? So using the $error object that is now connected to the myForm object on the scope, we can say that this object is required when there's been an error generated by the required directive on that field, which there is to start because there's nothing in that. So Let's do that for both, and we have. Now, let's go and click on that. And as you can see, the required goes away when there's text in the field. Awesome. So what happens if I actually did like that disabling behavior? How do we go and do that using Angular's form validation? What I can do is use the $valid value on my form and switch on that. And that $valid rolls up the requirements of all of the fields within the form and either sets true or false if the entire form is valid. So let's have a look and see how that's done. So now we can see that the button is disabled. And now it's enabled when the whole form is valid. Awesome. But what if we have something that's conditional, like a middle name field that actually doesn't need to be there? It's conditional. The person can put in a middle name or not. Let's try that out. So now we have a middle name field, but we want it to be conditional. So let's go and add just a checkbox so that we can define if it's actually required or not. Okay, so now we have that checkbox. Now we need to hook it into the ng required as its value. So needs middle connects to ng-required. And now this is only required if this button is checked. Required, not required. How cool is that? Conditional requirements. Easy as peasy. Okay, let's add an age field and check for just numbers in that. So what I'm going to do here is use an ng pattern that allows us to use a regex to check against the contents of the field to see if it's valid or not. So what I've done here is use the /d plus regex, which basically says, give me any sequence of numbers, but the plus says it's got to be at least one. And set that to the regex, the ng pattern for this field. And when that's bad, when it doesn't actually match that pattern, then an error is generated on the pattern value. So that we can key on that for bad age, which is pretty cool. So as you can see, we can go and type in text here, and it doesn't work. You can go and type in a number, and it does. Pretty rudimentary regex check. We do it a lot. So good stuff. Okay, so let's try a phone number, which is slightly more complex. And we'll enhance that regex. And let's try that out. 555-1212. And in this case, that's a good phone number. You can argue whether that's a reasonable phone number regex. Of course, it only handles one type of phone number. That's fine. There's a lot of regexes that you can find out on the web that will handle that for you, but that's neither here nor there. So both of these fields, now they have patterns, but we also want them to be required. So let's go and add that. But in this case, we're noting that even on an empty field, we're still not getting the correct validity check. So what we want to do is instead of using error pattern, we wanted to say $valid. But now we've got to go and invert the logic of ng-show to ng-hide, because in this case, valid is a good thing. So we'll only hide it if it's valid. So now this is checking that the age has numbers and is also required. Cool. There are also built-in field validators for max length and min length. These work like the ones that I've already shown. You can also, if you like, build your own custom validators by creating a directive and then hooking into the set validity mechanism. But that's not particularly easy, so you should probably look online with Bower to see if somebody's already written and shared a validator that you're looking for. So what have we learned? We've learned that writing validations the old-fashioned ways. And we've learned that Angular has a robust support for easy form validation that will check the fields required, even conditionally. For fields being a particular regex, you can use the format, a regex validator in that case. For fields being of a specific size, Very cool. Hopefully the next time you have a form that needs a bunch of client-side validations, you won't roll your eyes and so hard you'll start thinking about all the custom JS work with the nasty edge cases and all that, because you know you've got Angular on your side and a really good toolkit for you. But of course, always double check the validity of the input on the server side as well. You never know, sometimes people have their JavaScript turned off. I want to wrap up this course by giving you a bunch of different points on how to engage with the Angular community about web development more broadly. Yes, the Angular ecosystem is moving fast. Yes, it's got a lot of popularity, but it is because people like you and me invest in it, build applications on it, and then contribute back into the community as we can. The best way to do that is to build your Angular services and directives as Bower components and publish them on a site like bower.io here. We talked a little bit about that already and used a lot of Bower modules libraries as we've been going on in the course. Basically, it means registering a module and hanging off of a bunch of directives or services off of it. Then when you're ready, create a bower.json and Bower using Bower init and have it include all the files for your component as well as any dependencies. After that, I recommend building out the readme.md file to cover how to install and use your module effectively. Then check that all into GitHub or wherever your publicly accessible repo you want. But really, probably it's GitHub, it's free. And finally, go to the Bower site and register it. Once it's registered, try it out in a new project just to make sure that everything works properly. And once that's done, get it out into the ecosystem by contacting JavaScript news outlets like the Daily.js or JavaScript Weekly to promote it. And speaking of that type of thing, a question I'm often asked is how to keep up with JavaScript and Angular and the rest of it. And believe me, there's a lot of the rest of it. I use an RSS reader with a list of UI sites that I follow, and I encourage you to do the same. Here are just a few. The Daily.js is critical. I don't know a serious JS developer that isn't subscribed to this. AngularJS is another site, but it's more obviously focused on AngularJS. And there's a bunch of weekly mailers out there, like this one. This is the JavaScript Weekly. There are weeklies for CSS, Node, responsive design, Rails, all of it. And it's nice because it gets delivered via email and is a nice summary of the new stuff that's out there. And there's usually ads for jobs if you're looking for work. All right, there's also the Angular blog. And that's the official Angular blog, and that's always worth keeping an eye on, particularly as they come out with new releases. And yes, over time, they have broken older code, so definitely keep an eye on that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention egghead.io, the original Angular screencast series. The episodes are in-depth and very well produced. Now, so far, this has all been one way, people telling you stuff. If you want to interact with humans, then you should check out the Google forums on Angular by going to groups.google.io, forums, and then the forum Angular. There's also meetups on AngularJS. The one in Mountain View at the Googleplex is very popular, and they're almost always a capacity every single time. I presented there as well as Gardener presentations. The setup is great, and the food is good. There's also a regular Angular meetup in San Francisco, and check for one in your area on meetup.com. If you can't find for Angular, then you might want to look at one for Node or JavaScript or web design and more broadly. Even if they don't say it's Angular in particular, there isn't a JavaScript developer alive right now who doesn't know what Angular is and have an opinion on it. So there's a lot of potential for conversation. Now, all this is a good way to keep up with what's going on out there, but beyond that, I think there's some trends that you should keep your eye on. The first is web components. Web components that are an emerging standard that provides similar functionality to directives. You define new tags, and those tags have both behavior and layout all mixed together. An example of this is the Palmer project. If you want to get a taste of what that looks like today, this is what you should look at. It's a very exciting new framework for building modular UIs, and it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Another thing is React from Facebook on facebook.github.com/React. This is a client-side framework from them. It's very powerful and has very similar features to Angular. It hasn't taken off as much, perhaps because they have a language layer on top of JavaScript that allows you to mix HTML code directly into your JavaScript code, which is cool, but I'm not sure I'm 100% of a fan yet. It's definitely worth keeping an eye on because, it's Facebook. And finally, another serious trend happening right now is real-time. In the context of web, real-time just means marketing speak for WebSockets. WebSockets have been around for a while, but have only recently started to blow up in a big way. WebSockets provide a continuous connection between the browser and the server, so messages are delivered instantly, or as near to instant as the internet gets, instead of after some polling delay. So it's ideal for updating pages with a live stream of data. Think like chat systems or stock tickers or Instagram photo feeds, anything real-time. At this time, there's no stock Angular binding for WebSockets, like there is for HTTP and REST resources, but I have a hunch that this will change. On the programming side, you should really become familiar with the functional side of programming. The way that I've used JavaScript in this course, with the exception of the D3 code, has been primarily imperative programming. It's somewhat difficult to define exactly what functional programming is, but think of it as building up your application using lots of smaller, reusable functions. In the JavaScript world, this is exemplified by libraries like underscore, as you can see here, or Lodash. There is also a good book on functional programming in JavaScript using these libraries. In addition, understanding functional programming, callbacks, closures will help you a lot as you learn Node.js, and Node.js is wicked hot nowadays. So speaking of Node.js in the back end, if you're a full stack engineer and you do database work, I'd strongly recommend looking at NoSQL databases, as the trend in API seems to be more and more along the lines of storing JSON blobs and just JSON-based REST APIs. NoSQL databases reduce the friction in going between the databases and JSON tremendously, since they tend to work natively in JSON. But with all the talk about the back end, let's not ignore the front end. If you are doing Angular, you'll most likely be called upon to fix HTML layout and CSS issues now and again, and that means keeping up with responsive frameworks like Bootstrap and Foundation, as well as CSS3, particularly when it comes to transitions and animations. And if you're into visualizations and you want to invest some serious time into both SVG, the scalable vector graphic standard, and D3, which makes copious use of SVG. And if you're really a visualizations geek, I can't help but stress enough that you should go to see Edward Tufte speak and read his 4 excellent books on data visualization. As Carly Simon says, nobody does it better. And that certainly applies to Edward Tufte and data visualizations. Well, that does it for me. There's certainly a lot to keep up with out there, but it's an exciting time that we live in, so it's cool and fun to see where the tech world is going. Thanks for buying this course and being part of the amazing journey for me in developing this material. If it's helped you or inspired you to build some amazing things, let me know. So get going. Build some cool stuff. Go. Leave. Why are you still here?